The dark side experiments on Biss had always pushed the boundaries of what the Force could endure. Deep within the throne world's most forbidden chambers, where even the Emperor's royal guards dared not tread, Palpatine stood before an obsidian altar, pulsing with malevolent energy. Around him, 12 hooded acolytes chanted in the ancient tongue of the Sith, their voices weaving through the Force like razors through flesh. The ritual was ambitious, even by Sidious's standards. He sought to pierce the veil between dimensions, to reach into the cosmic void where immortality itself might be grasped and bound to his will. The dark side coiled around him like a serpent, feeding on his malice, his hatred, his endless hunger for power that transcended mere galactic domination. But power answers to power, and sin calls to judgment. The altar cracked, not from within, but from beyond, as if reality itself had been struck by something that did not belong. The acolytes' chanting faltered as temperature in the chamber plummeted, then surged to infernal heat. Palpatine's yellow eyes widened fractionally, the only outward sign of his surprise as the Force itself seemed to recoil in primal terror. "Impossible," he whispered. But the word died in his throat. The rift opened with the sound of 1,000 screaming souls. It wasn't hyperspace tearing. This was different, wrong. A wound in the very fabric of existence that bled orange hellfire into the sterile darkness of the Sith chamber. Through the breach came a presence that registered to Force sensitives across Biss as pure, undiluted judgment. Not the judgment of law or philosophy, but something far more ancient and absolute. The temperature spiked again. Acolytes nearest the rift ignited spontaneously, their screams cut short as hellfire consumed not their bodies, but something deeper, their very souls burning away, like parchment in a furnace. Palpatine raised his hands, dark side lightning crackling between his fingers, but even he hesitated. What approached through that dimensional wound was other. It existed outside the duality of light and dark, beyond the Force's understanding. A chain came through first, wreathed in flames that burned orange and white hot. It struck the obsidian floor and melted through durasteel beneath, the metal weeping as it liquefied. Then came the source, a figure astride a vehicle that shouldn't exist, its engine roaring with the sound of damnation itself. The motorcycle hit the chamber floor with impossible force, leaving burning tire tracks that would smolder for days. Ghost Rider had arrived. The spirit of vengeance turned its flaming skull toward the Emperor of the Galactic Empire. And in that moment, Palpatine felt something he had not experienced in decades. Genuine fear. The hollow eye sockets burned with hellfire that illuminated truths the dark side preferred hidden. This was not a Force user. This was not even a being from this reality. This was judgment incarnate, and it had been drawn here by the sheer weight of sin that saturated the galaxy. "You are guilty," the rider spoke, its voice a chorus of the damned. The words bypassed ears entirely, resonating directly in the soul. "This galaxy bleeds with innocent blood. I feel it. Every murdered child, every enslaved world. Every soul crying for justice that will never come." The remaining acolytes broke formation and fled. Their screams echoed through Biss's corridors as hellfire pursued them like hunting hounds, selective and merciless. Palpatine stood his ground, calling upon reserves of dark side power that had corrupted star systems. Lightning cascaded from his fingers in torrents that would have reduced mountains to ash. The hellfire consumed it all without slowing. "The Force cannot save you from what you have become," Ghost Rider said, advancing. His chain whipped out, moving with predatory intelligence. "You have drowned this galaxy in suffering. Now you will know every moment of pain you have inflicted." Palpatine's composure finally cracked. With a gesture, he collapsed the chamber's ceiling. Tons of reinforced durasteel and stone falling between himself and the spirit of vengeance. He fled through hidden passages, his mind racing. This entity, whatever it was, represented a threat beyond mere physical danger. It threatened the very foundation of his existence, not just his life, but his soul. Behind him, the debris exploded outward as Ghost Rider's motorcycle tore through, Hellfire trailing in its wake. The rider paused only to place a burning hand on a dying acolyte's forehead. The man's eyes went wide as the Penance Stare took hold, forcing him to experience every innocent life his dark rituals had destroyed. His screams lasted 3 seconds before his soul was consumed, adding its energy to the hellfire that now burned brighter than before. The spirit of vengeance had tasted the guilt of this galaxy, and it was infinite. Across biss, Force sensitives felt the disturbance, a wrongness that made the dark side seem almost comforting by comparison. In the Imperial Palace, Vader stopped mid-sentence during a tactical briefing, his mechanical breathing faltering as he sensed judgment. On Dagobah, Yoda's ears drooped as he felt a presence that made him profoundly sad. "Arrived, something has," he murmured. "Neither light nor dark. Punishment itself." On Tatooine, in a modest dwelling on the edge of the Dune Sea, Obi-Wan Kenobi gasped and dropped his tea. The Force showed him a vision of flames consuming star systems, of a flaming skull passing judgment on the guilty without mercy or distinction. And in that vision, he saw something that chilled him more than any Sith Lord ever had. He saw that almost everyone in the galaxy was guilty of something. Ghost Rider emerged from Bys's palace into the polluted twilight of the throne world. Below him spread a city of billions, built on the labor of slaves and sustained by the suffering of countless worlds. The rider's hellfire pulsed, responding to the concentration of guilt like a predator scenting blood. The motorcycle's engine roared, a sound that would haunt survivors' nightmares for years to come. Ghost Rider looked up at the star-filled sky, at the thousands of worlds spinning through the void, each one crying out with the weight of accumulated sin. Order 66, Alderaan, the Jedi Purge, slavery, genocide, tyranny, war crimes beyond counting. "This galaxy burns with guilt," the rider declared to the uncaring stars. "And I am vengeance. I am judgment. I am the Ghost Rider. And I will consume the guilty until only the innocent remain, or until there is nothing left to judge." The hellfire spread from his form like a living thing, touching the minds of the guilty across biss. Thousands heard his declaration, felt his presence like a brand upon their souls. The spirit of vengeance had come to the Star Wars galaxy, drawn by sins that spanned light years and decades. The purge had begun. If you want to see more characters enter the Star Wars galaxy, hit that subscribe button and drop the name of a character you'd want to see in the comments below. May the Force be with you. Coruscant never truly slept. The galactic capital's trillion inhabitants created a constant hum of life that echoed through the Force like a massive, chaotic heartbeat. Tonight, that heartbeat stuttered. In Sector 4290, an Imperial officer named Commander Voss finished his shift at the detention center. He had personally supervised the execution of 17 political prisoners that day. Men and women, whose only crime was speaking against the Empire's increasingly brutal policies. It was routine work now, 3 years into the New Order. He barely thought about it anymore as he walked toward the transit station, already planning which cantina would help him forget another day of blood and bureaucracy. The temperature dropped 30 degrees in an instant. Voss stopped, breath misting before his face despite Coruscant's climate-controlled atmosphere. The usual crowd of pedestrians had vanished from the platform. Somewhere in the distance, he heard a sound that didn't belong in this technological monument to civilization. The rumble of something ancient and wrathful, like an engine forged in hell itself. Orange light flickered across the durasteel walls. Voss turned slowly. Imperial training warring with primal instinct that screamed at him to run. Down the empty transit corridor, Hellfire traced patterns on the walls, symbols from no language he recognized, but that his soul understood perfectly. Judgment. Ghost Rider emerged from the shadows, astride his burning motorcycle. The spirit of vengeance had spent the last 6 hours traversing Coruscant's underlevels, following the psychic trail of guilt that saturated every deck of the city planet. Each guilty soul consumed made him more attuned to this galaxy's particular flavor of sin. The casual cruelty of empire, the systematic erasure of hope, the bureaucratic murder disguised as order. "Commander Voss," the rider spoke, and the officer's name sounded like an accusation. 17 souls today, 492 this month, 6,318 since you took command of Detention Center OREX-7. Voss's hand went to his blaster, but his fingers were numb with supernatural cold. "What are you? Some kind of Jedi trick?" "Look into my eyes." The command carried the weight of cosmic inevitability. Voss tried to look away, tried to close his eyes, tried to do anything but meet that Hellfire gaze. His body refused to obey. The Penance Stare locked onto him like tractor beams, and suddenly Commander Voss was no longer standing on a transit platform. He was in the detention center, but not as himself. He was Jessup Harn, the teacher from Naboo who had organized peaceful protests against forced labor. He felt the cold durasteel wall against his back, felt the terror as blasters powered up, felt the burning agony as bolts tore through his chest. Then he was someone else. Tolan Mir, father of 3, executed for hiding refugees. The pain compounded, multiplying, each death experienced in excruciating detail. 6,318 deaths. 6,318 moments of terror, agony, and despair, experienced consecutively, completely, absolutely. Voss's screams lasted 43 seconds before his mind shattered. His soul, laid bare and judged, ignited with hellfire from within. The flames consumed him utterly, leaving only a scorched outline on the platform floor and the faint smell of burning guilt. Ghost Rider's chain rattled as he coiled it back around his torso. One guilty soul consumed. Trillions more waited. The incident was reported within minutes. Imperial security forces arrived to find only burn marks and terrified witnesses babbling about a flaming skeleton on a vehicle that shouldn't exist. The reports filtered up through layers of bureaucracy until they reached the desk of an ISB colonel who had seen enough strange things in service to the Empire to know when something genuinely dangerous had arrived. 3 districts over, the rider found his next target. Captain Dren supervised a slave processing facility in the industrial sector. Wookiees, Twi'leks, humans. Species didn't matter. They came in as prisoners or relocated populations and left as property of the Imperial war machine. Dren took pride in his efficiency. The facility processed 2,000 beings per week, with minimal mortality rates during transport. He considered himself humane by Imperial standards. Ghost Rider's motorcycle tore through the facility's main gate, Hellfire melting the security checkpoint to slag. Dren watched through surveillance feeds as the burning figure dismounted and walked through his carefully organized facility. Guards opened fire with blaster rifles. the bolts passed through the rider harmlessly or were absorbed by Hellfire that burned brighter with each attack. "Seal the command center," Dren ordered his subordinates. "Whatever that thing is, Durasteel will stop it." The door exploded inward moments later, torn from its hinges by a chain that moved like a living serpent. Ghost Rider entered the command center, his burning skull rotating to assess each officer present. 3 fled immediately. 2 others drew weapons they knew were useless. Dren, to his credit, stood his ground. "I follow orders," he said, voice steady despite the sweat beading on his forehead. "I'm a soldier of the Empire. Everything I've done is sanctioned by Imperial law." "Law does not absolve sin," Ghost Rider replied. "You knew they were innocent. You heard them beg. You saw families torn apart. And you continued because it was efficient." The rider's hand shot out, gripping Dren's face. The Penance Stare took hold, and the captain experienced 2 years of slavery operations from the perspective of his victims. The Wookiee cub separated from its mother, howling in desperation. The Twi'lek dancer sold to a Hutt crime lord who would work her to death. The human child who asked why this was happening again and again, until hope died in their eyes. Dren's soul burned. The Hellfire consumed him completely, adding his guilt to the growing conflagration. Behind the rider, the facility's slaves watched through transparent steel. They didn't understand what was happening, couldn't comprehend the theological implications of a spirit of vengeance in their galaxy. But they recognized justice when they saw it, even if that justice wore a flaming skull. Ghost Rider turned to them, and for a moment, the Hellfire dimmed. "You are innocent," he said simply. Then his chain shattered their restraints with surgical precision, the Hellfire melting through Durasteel shackles without touching flesh. "Go." They fled into Coruscant's night, freed by something they would later describe as either demon or angel, depending on which side of guilt they viewed it from. By dawn, 17 Imperial facilities across Coruscant had been hit. Officers, bureaucrats, enforcers, anyone whose hands were stained with innocent blood found themselves facing the Penance Stare. Bodies were never recovered. Only burn marks remained, and the lingering psychic echo of judgment that made Force sensitives physically ill when they approached the sites. The HoloNet newsfeed struggled to explain the phenomenon. Rebel sabotage, they claimed. Jedi terrorism. Anything but the truth, that something from beyond their understanding had arrived to weigh their souls and found the Empire catastrophically wanting. In the Imperial Palace, Darth Vader received the reports with cold fury. 19 officers lost in a single night. No bodies recovered. Witnesses describing a burning demon that killed with a look. The local ISB commander suggested investigating Force-sensitive insurgents. Perhaps a surviving Jedi with unusual abilities. Vader crushed the datapad in his mechanical hand. "No Jedi could do this," he said, his voice distorted through his mask's vocabulary. "This is something else. Something other." He could feel it in the Force. A wrongness that made even the dark side recoil. Whatever had arrived on Biss and now hunted through Coruscant streets existed outside the natural order. It was neither alive nor dead in any conventional sense, and it radiated an intent that Vader recognized with intimate familiarity. Judgment without mercy, vengeance without compromise. The Dark Lord of the Sith activated his comlink. "Prepare my shuttle. I will investigate these incidents personally." Across the galaxy, Ghost Rider's presence rippled through the Force like a stone thrown into still water. On Dagobah, Yoda meditated deeply, seeking understanding of this new element in the cosmic balance. On Tatooine, Obi-Wan felt a disturbance that suggested the war between light and dark had become infinitely more complicated. On the Death Star, Grand Moff Tarkin received reports of the Coruscant incidents and filed them away, unconcerned. He had no innocent blood on his hands, he believed. Alderaan was a necessary example. The Empire required order, and order required fear. The Death Star's approach vector would eventually bring it within range of Coruscant. When it did, Ghost Rider would sense the concentration of guilt aboard that battle station like a supernova in the darkness. But first, there were millions more on Coruscant alone who had participated in the Empire's machinery of oppression. The spirit of vengeance had found a hunting ground beyond anything his human host had imagined possible. A galaxy where sin was institutional, where cruelty was policy, and where the guilty numbered in the billions. The Hellfire burned brighter. The hunt continued, and across Coruscant, those with innocent blood on their hands began to feel a presence watching from the shadows, waiting with infinite patience for the moment when they would have to answer for everything they had done. The Emperor's throne room on Coruscant possessed a darkness that went beyond mere absence of light. The shadows here had weight, substance, fed by decades of Sith alchemy and malevolent intent. It was here that Palpatine sat, his yellow eyes reflecting the blue hologram of Darth Vader kneeling before him. 27 facilities attacked in 3 days, my lord, Vader reported, his breathing the only sound in the cavernous chamber. 43 officers consumed, no bodies recovered. The pattern is consistent. Those with direct involvement in detention operations, slave processing, or civilian suppression are targeted with absolute precision. And the perpetrator? Palpatine's voice was deceptively calm, but Vader could sense the roiling fury beneath. Witnesses describe a humanoid figure wreathed in flames, riding a vehicle of unknown origin. It speaks of judgment and guilt. Force sensitives report a presence that exists outside the normal spectrum of light and dark side influence. Vader paused, his mechanical hands clenching. I believe this is connected to your experiments on Biss, Master. The silence stretched. Palpatine rose from his throne with measured deliberation, descending the steps toward the hologram. The ritual was meant to pierce dimensional barriers, to touch realms where true immortality might be claimed. Instead, it appears we have invited something unintended. What is it? A complication? Palpatine's lips curved in a smile that held no humor. The acolytes who survived long enough to report before their deaths spoke of a spirit of vengeance, an entity that judges sin and consumes the guilty. It appears to operate on cosmic principles that supersede the Force itself. Vader's breathing intensified slightly, the closest he came to expressing concern. Can it be destroyed? Everything can be destroyed, Lord Vader. The question is whether the cost of destruction exceeds the value of allowing it to continue. Palpatine moved to the vast transparisteel viewport, overlooking Coruscant's glittering expanse. Consider, this entity targets those guilty of crimes against innocence. Our Empire has, by necessity, committed many such acts in the pursuit of order. However, so have the rebels. So have the criminal syndicates. So have countless others across the galaxy. You would allow it to continue killing Imperial personnel. I would observe its nature before committing resources. Palpatine turned, his expression calculating. But I cannot allow it to operate freely in my capital. You will hunt this spirit of vengeance, study it, test its limitations, determine if it can be destroyed, controlled, or redirected toward more useful targets. Vader bowed. As you wish, my master. "One more thing, Lord Vader." Palpatine's voice dropped to a whisper that somehow carried perfectly across the transmission. "Be cautious. This entity judges guilt, and you of all people carry sins that would fuel its flames for years. Do not look into its eyes. Do not engage it directly until you understand its full capabilities." That is not a suggestion. It is a command. The hologram flickered out, leaving Vader alone in his meditation chamber aboard the Executor. The Dark Lord of the Sith sat motionless, processing his master's warning. Guilt. The word resonated through his thoughts like a discordant note in a symphony. Vader knew guilt intimately. It was the foundation upon which his existence had been built. Padme's death, the Jedi Temple, the younglings, Mustafar, every moment of weakness that had led him to kneel before Sidious. The dark side had taught him to channel guilt into strength, to transmute regret into power. But this entity apparently did not allow such alchemy. It simply judged, condemned, and consumed. For the first time in years, Darth Vader felt something approaching trepidation. 3 districts away, Ghost Rider stood atop a transit hub, his Hellfire casting long shadows across the Ferrocrete platform. Below him, Coruscant's nightlife pulsed. Billions of beings going about their lives, most of them carrying small guilts, minor sins, the accumulated moral debris of existence in an imperfect galaxy. The rider could sense them all, a vast tapestry of innocence and guilt woven together in impossible complexity. But certain threads burned brighter, calling to him with the weight of innocent blood. An Imperial recruiter who pressed children into service through coercion and lies. A corporate executive whose policies resulted in factory deaths that were statistically acceptable. A former Clone Wars officer who had executed prisoners rather than processed them properly. The chain rattled in his grip, eager. The Hellfire pulsed in rhythm with the galaxy's collective guilt. Johnny Blaze, the human consciousness still present within the spirit of vengeance, tried to process the sheer scale of what they faced. This isn't just a city. Johnny's thoughts echoed within the rider's consciousness. This is an entire galaxy. Thousands of worlds, trillions of people. How many are guilty? How many deserve judgment? All who have innocent blood on their hands, the rider responded, its voice reverberating through both their shared mental space. This galaxy bleeds with injustice. The guilty have built empires on the corpses of the innocent. We will burn until only the pure remain. That could take forever. That could mean consuming billions. Then we will consume billions. Johnny's horror at the implication warred with the rider's absolute certainty. This was the eternal struggle within Ghost Rider. The human conscience versus the spirit of vengeance's unyielding judgment. In their home dimension, the balance had been manageable. Cities, countries, even continents could be cleansed eventually. But an entire galaxy? The internal debate was interrupted by the sensation of power approaching. Not the Force. Ryder had learned to recognize that pervasive energy field that seemed to touch everything in this dimension. This was different. Darker, concentrated. Darth Vader's shuttle descended toward the transit hub with Imperial precision. The Dark Lord had tracked the rider's pattern, had predicted his next appearance through simple logic. The entity followed guilt, and Sector 7829 housed 3 detention facilities and a slave processing center. It was inevitable that Ghost Rider would appear here. The shuttle's ramp descended, and Vader emerged into the flickering orange light of Hellfire. He was imposing even by the standards of beings Ghost Rider had faced. 7 feet of black armor, cape billowing despite the still air, mechanical breathing that sounded like a countdown to violence. But it was what lay beneath the armor that made the rider's hellfire burn brighter. "So much guilt," Johnny whispered internally. "I can feel it from here." "What did he do?" "Everything," the rider answered. "He has drowned worlds in blood. Children, families, his own brothers in arms. This one's guilt could fuel hellfire for 1,000 years." Vader stopped 30 feet from Ghost Rider, his hand resting on his lightsaber, but not yet drawing it. "You have killed Imperial personnel," he stated, his voice mechanical and emotionless. "This will cease immediately. You are guilty." Ghost Rider's declaration echoed across the platform. "The innocent blood on your hands cries out for judgment. The children in the temple, the woman you loved, the peace you destroyed. You know your crimes, Anakin Skywalker." The name hit Vader like a physical blow. The force around him rippled with shock and fury. "That name no longer has meaning," he said, but his voice had lost its certainty. "Names are irrelevant. Souls remember." Ghost Rider stepped forward, chain uncoiling. "You were meant to bring balance, but you brought only fire and death. Now you will face the flames you have earned." Vader's lightsaber ignited, crimson blade humming in the night air. "I have faced Jedi Masters, Sith Lords, and beings of power you cannot comprehend. You will not find me easy prey, demon. I am not a demon." The rider's motorcycle materialized beneath him, engine roaring to life with supernatural fury. "I am judgment. I am vengeance for every innocent life you have taken. I am what awaits when the darkness can no longer hide your sins." The chain lashed out faster than thought, wreathed in hellfire that burned away the very concept of mercy. Vader's lightsaber intercepted it, the blade passing through the chain without severing it. Because the chain was not merely physical. It existed partially in the realm of soul and spirit, and even a lightsaber could not cut what was not entirely matter. The impact sent Vader sliding backward, his boots scoring the ferrocrete. The Force screamed warning, but even his precognition seemed sluggish against the rider's attacks. This entity moved according to rules that superseded the natural order, operated on principles that the Force itself seemed unable to fully predict. Vader extended his hand, calling upon the dark side to crush Ghost Rider with telekinetic force that could crumple Dura-steel. The invisible pressure slammed into the rider, and for a moment, nothing happened. Then the hellfire flared, consuming the telekinetic attack like fuel, growing brighter and hotter. "The Force cannot save you," Ghost Rider said, advancing. "Your power is life energy twisted to your will. Mine is judgment, and judgment transcends power." The motorcycle surged forward, and Vader was forced to leap aside with force-enhanced speed. The rider's chain wrapped around a support column and tore it free, swinging the massive Dura-steel beam like a weapon. Vader deflected it with the Force, but the effort cost him. The chain's hellfire had ignited the metal, and the heat was intense even through his armor's life support. They fought across the transit hub, and watching beings scattered in terror. Vader's lightsaber traced crimson arcs through the air, his combat form perfect despite the strain. Ghost Rider's chain danced like a living thing, each strike carrying the weight of divine retribution. When lightsaber met chain, reality seemed to shudder at the collision of incompatible physics. "You are skilled," the rider acknowledged, "but skill cannot overcome what you are. A murderer, a betrayer, a monster wearing the skin of a hero. I am what the galaxy required me to become." Vader's shout carried more emotion than he had expressed in years. Force lightning erupted from his gloved hands. Not Palpatine's level of power, but still enough to fry a living being to ash. The lightning struck Ghost Rider directly, crackling across his burning form. For 3 seconds, it seemed to work. The Hellfire dimmed, and the rider's advance slowed. Then the spirit of vengeance absorbed the energy, and the Hellfire exploded outward with twice its previous intensity. "Your darkness feeds me," Ghost Rider said. "Every sin strengthens the judgment. Every crime makes the flames burn hotter. You cannot win this, Anakin. You can only face what you have done." Vader felt true fear then. Not for his life, which he had stopped valuing years ago, but for his soul. Because in that moment, he understood what this entity truly was. Not a Force user, not even a being from this dimension. It was cosmic justice incarnate, and it had come to collect a debt he could never fully pay. The rider's hand reached out, Hellfire-wreathed fingers extending toward Vader's mask. The Dark Lord tried to retreat, to call upon every reserve of dark side power he possessed to escape. But the chain wrapped around his leg held him in place with strength that seemed to increase the more he struggled. "Look into my eyes," Ghost Rider commanded. "Face what you have done." Vader's mask turned away, his breathing rapid and irregular. "No. You cannot refuse judgment." The rider pulled, dragging Vader closer despite his Force-enhanced resistance. The gap closed to 10 feet, then 5. Ghost Rider's burning skull filled Vader's vision, and the hollow sockets that held Hellfire instead of eyes seemed to pierce through his mask, through his armor, through every defense he had built around his shattered soul. Their gazes locked. The Penance Stare began. The Penance Stare was absolute. It did not ask permission, did not accept resistance, did not acknowledge the barriers between souls. When Ghost Rider's Hellfire gaze locked onto Darth Vader, the Dark Lord of the Sith found himself standing in the Jedi Temple on Coruscant 23 years in the past. But he was not Vader. He was not even Anakin Skywalker. He was Padawan Jax Tarek, 12 years old, hiding in the temple archives as clone troopers marched through the corridors. He heard the screams, the blaster fire, the crackling of a lightsaber cutting through his fellow younglings. Then, Anakin Skywalker, no, Vader himself, appeared in the doorway, eyes yellow with dark side corruption. Vader felt the terror, felt the confusion. "Master Skywalker is here, he'll save us," followed by the horror of understanding. Felt the lightsaber pierce his small chest, the burning agony, the betrayal more painful than death itself. Felt his last thought. Why? Then he was someone else. Padawan Sarah Kato, 14, gifted in healing, who had always admired Master Skywalker's heroism. He experienced her death, and the deaths after, hundreds of Jedi, cut down in the temple, each one a separate agony, a separate betrayal, a separate moment of innocence destroyed by his own hand. The Penance Stare did not stop there. He was a separatist officer on Mustafar, loyal to Count Dooku, believing in the cause of independence from Republic corruption. Vader, still transitioning from Anakin, cut him down without hesitation, without even acknowledging his pleas for mercy. The officer had committed no atrocity, had overseen no war crimes. He simply stood in the wrong place when Vader needed to vent his rage. He was a rebel soldier on Scarif, fighting to steal the Death Star plans, believing in hope for the galaxy. He felt Vader's lightsaber slice through his back, felt his spine sever, felt himself collapse, knowing he would never see his family again. He was Captain Antilles aboard the Tantive Afur, throat crushed in Vader's mechanical grip, dying slowly while trying to protect Princess Leia and the rebellion secrets. He was a Force-sensitive child on Braca, hidden by his parents, discovered by Inquisitors following Vader's orders. He felt the terror as the Inquisitors arrived, felt his mother die trying to protect him, felt his own execution at age 7 because his sensitivity to the Force made him a threat to the Empire. The deaths compounded, multiplied. Each one experienced in full, complete, excruciating detail. Not just the physical pain, the Penance Stare forced the guilty to experience the emotional and spiritual devastation they had inflicted. Every shattered hope, every destroyed dream, every family torn apart, every child who died, wondering why the galaxy had become so cruel. Hundreds became thousands. Thousands became tens of thousands. And still the Penance Stare continued, because Vader's guilt ran deeper than mere numbers. He experienced Padmé's death from her perspective, felt her heartbreak at his fall to darkness, felt her desperate hope that some good remained in him, felt her die believing she had failed to save the man she loved. That death alone could have broken lesser beings. But the Stare was merciless. He felt the grief of every Jedi who had trusted him, believed in him, fought beside him. Masters, knights, Padawans, all betrayed by the chosen one they had defended when the Council questioned his training. He felt Obi-Wan's anguish on Mustafar, the soul-deep pain of having to maim the brother he loved, the guilt Kenobi carried for failing to save Anakin from himself. He felt Ahsoka's devastation when she learned of his transformation, the way her faith in the Jedi Order and in her master died simultaneously. He felt the terror of the younglings as their protector became their executioner, their innocent trust transforming into confused horror in the seconds before death. The Penance Stare pulled him through 2 decades of atrocity. Every execution, every planet subjugated, every innocent life snuffed out in service to the Empire's cruel order. Not just those he killed directly, but those who died because of his actions, his orders, his willingness to serve Palpatine's vision of galactic tyranny. Time lost meaning. The Penance Stare existed outside linear experience, forcing Vader to experience decades of guilt in what might have been seconds or might have been years. His mechanical body stood frozen on the transit platform, trembling with internal strain as his soul was laid bare and judged. Inside the Stare's grasp, Vader tried to summon the dark side, tried to channel his pain into strength as he had learned. But the dark side itself seemed absent here, or perhaps refused to answer. The Penance Stare existed in a realm where power was irrelevant. Only guilt and innocence mattered, and Vader's guilt was an ocean. "This is what you are." Ghost Rider's voice echoed through the experience. "This is what you have done. Face it, accept it, burn for it." But something unexpected happened. Where other souls had shattered and been consumed under the weight of their crimes, Vader's soul, fractured, scarred, twisted though it was, endured. Not because he was stronger, but because he had already spent 20 years living in his own personal hell. Every breath through his mask reminded him of Mustafar. Every mechanical heartbeat echoed with Padmé's death. Every time he looked in a mirror, he saw the monster he had become. Vader already knew his guilt. He lived with it every moment of every day, using the dark side to transmute it into fuel for his power. The Penance Stare showed him his crimes from new perspectives, forced him to experience what his victims felt. But the fundamental nature of his guilt was not news. He had murdered younglings. He had destroyed the Jedi. He had choked the life from the woman he loved, even if indirectly. He already knew. The Penance Stare, designed to shatter souls with revelation of their evil, found in Vader a soul that had already been shattered by the same truth. It was like trying to drown a man who had learned to breathe underwater. The torment was real, the agony genuine, but it could not break what was already broken. You cannot destroy me with my own guilt. Vader's thought resonated through the stare's connection. I am built from it. I wear it like my armor. You show me horrors I relive every day. Ghost Rider's Hellfire intensified, pouring more judgment, more accusation, more righteous fury into the connection. But Vader's soul, forged in the fires of self-hatred and dark side alchemy, refused to ignite. Not because he was innocent, he was perhaps the most guilty being in the galaxy, but because his guilt had become foundational to his existence. The Penance Stare released him. Vader collapsed to one knee, his breathing ragged and irregular. Warning lights flashed across his armor's interior displays. His heart's beat irregularly. The experience had pushed his damaged cardiovascular system to its limits. But he was alive. His soul, as corrupted and twisted as it was, remained intact. Ghost Rider stepped back, and for the first time since arriving in this galaxy, the spirit of vengeance experienced something approaching confusion. You should have burned, the rider said, genuine puzzlement in his tone. Your guilt is vast. The innocent blood on your hands could drown worlds. Why do you still stand? Vader rose slowly, using the Force to steady himself. His lightsaber had fallen during the stare. He called it to his hand with a gesture. Because I already burn, he said, his voice raw even through the vocabulator's distortion. Every moment of every day. You showed me nothing I do not already know, demon. You cannot damn what is already damned. The rider's hellfire pulsed, uncertain. In millennia of existence across dimensions, the spirit of vengeance had encountered beings who survived the Penance Stare through righteousness, through genuine innocence, or through divine protection. Never before had it encountered someone who survived through intimate familiarity with their own damnation. You are guilty, Ghost Rider insisted, but the absolute certainty had wavered slightly. Yes. Vader's agreement was simple, total. I am guilty of everything you showed me and more. But guilt does not mean you can destroy me. I have made my choices. I live with their consequences, and I will not submit to judgment from a being who understands nothing of this galaxy's complexity. Complexity does not excuse murder. No, Vader agreed. Nothing excuses it, but understanding it, living with it, gives me something your absolute judgment lacks: the will to continue despite damnation. Ghost Rider's chain rattled, the hellfire brightening as the rider prepared to attack through conventional means rather than supernatural judgment. But before either could move, a new presence made itself known. Across the transit hub, a dozen Imperial Star Destroyers emerged from hyperspace, their massive forms visible in Coruscant's night sky. The Emperor had decided that observation was complete. Now came subjugation. Turbo lasers lanced down from orbit, not aimed at Ghost Rider directly. Palpatine was too cunning for that, but at the surrounding infrastructure. Towers collapsed, platforms shattered, and civilians who had been fleeing the confrontation found themselves trapped by falling debris. Ghost Rider's attention snapped to the destruction, to the screams of innocents caught in the bombardment. His purpose was judgment of the guilty, but it was also protection of the innocent. The Empire had just created a tactical dilemma: pursue Vader or save the civilians. The rider chose mercy over vengeance. His motorcycle materialized, and he raced toward the collapsing structures, his chain lashing out to catch falling ferrocrete before it could crush fleeing families. Hellfire, which burned the guilty, now formed barriers to shield the innocent from Imperial aggression. Vader watched for a moment, seeing the entity that had nearly destroyed his soul now working frantically to save lives. The contradiction was striking. A being of absolute judgment and vengeance also possessed absolute protection of innocence. The duality reminded him uncomfortably of the Jedi at their best, before the Order's dogma had calcified into rigidity. "Lord Vader," his comlink crackled, "the Emperor commands your immediate return. The entity's capabilities have been assessed. We are implementing Containment Protocol Omega." Vader took one last look at Ghost Rider, who had created a Hellfire shield protecting 24 civilians from a collapsing transit tower. "Understood," he said into the comlink. As his shuttle descended to retrieve him, Vader processed what he had learned. The entity could not be killed by facing its own judgment. At least, not beings like himself, who already understood their damnation. But it was vulnerable in other ways. It prioritized innocence. It operated on principles that, while absolute, were also predictable once understood. And most critically, it did not distinguish between Imperial guilt and Rebel guilt, between Jedi failure and Sith atrocity. It judged all, which meant the Emperor's greatest fear, that the entity would focus solely on the Empire, was unfounded. Ghost Rider could become a weapon if properly aimed, or a catastrophe if left unchecked. The challenge was determining which outcome served the Empire's interests. Vader boarded his shuttle, his thoughts churning. The Penance Stare had shown him his crimes from new angles, had forced him to experience what he had spent years avoiding. But it had also revealed something unexpected. Beneath the guilt and the dark side corruption, beneath the mechanical horror and the self-loathing, some fragment of Anakin Skywalker's soul still existed. It was buried deep, twisted and scarred, but it had survived. And in the moment when the Penance Stare had forced him to experience Padme's death from her perspective, he had felt her final emotion: hope. Hope that the good in him could be redeemed. The thought was dangerous, potentially fatal. Vader crushed it with practiced dark side discipline, channeling the emotional vulnerability into cold fury. But some fragment remained, a seed of doubt planted by the very entity meant to destroy him. As Vader's shuttle rose into Coruscant's sky, Ghost Rider finished evacuating the last civilians from the bombardment zone. He stood amid the rubble, his Hellfire casting dancing shadows on the destruction, and looked up at the star destroyers dominating the sky. So much guilt aboard those vessels. Officers who had destroyed planets, soldiers who had massacred innocents, a chain of command built on fear and oppression. The spirit of vengeance could sense them all, thousands of guilty souls floating in orbit, thinking themselves safe behind durasteel and turbolasers. "Your judgment is coming," Ghost Rider declared to the uncaring sky. "No distance, no armor, no power can shield the guilty forever. I will consume you all, one by one, until this galaxy learns that evil has consequences." The motorcycle's engine roared, and the rider vanished into Coruscant's undercity, where millions more waited to be judged. In his throne room, Palpatine watched holographic feeds of the encounter, his expression thoughtful. Vader had survived the entity's judgment through a loophole the Emperor had not anticipated. Pre-existing damnation created immunity to revelation. Interesting, useful, and potentially a template for protecting other valuable servants. But the entity's power to judge and consume remained undeniable. Left unchecked, it could devastate Imperial command structure within months. But if controlled, redirected, or simply distracted with alternate targets, Palpatine smiled, and the shadows in his throne room seemed to smile with him. The undercity of Coruscant existed in perpetual twilight, kilometers below the glittering spires where politicians debated and emperors schemed. Here, the Empire's laws held less sway, replaced by the older rules of survival, territory, and violent negotiation. It was into this realm that Ghost Rider descended, following the psychic trail of guilt that burned through the darkness like a beacon. Level 3204 housed one of the largest spice processing operations on the planet, run by a Hutt cartel subsidiary that paid just enough in bribes to operate with Imperial blessing. The workers, mostly Twi'leks, Rhodians, and humans who had fallen through society's cracks, labored in conditions that would have violated every civilized world's labor laws. But the Undercity wasn't civilized, and the Empire didn't care as long as the credits flowed upward. Overseer Yun Rakor surveyed his operation from a fortified booth, counting credits in his head. 12 workers had died this month from chemical exposure, but replacements were cheap in the Undercity. He considered it acceptable attrition. The profit margins more than justified a few corpses dumped in the lower levels where no one would ask questions. The temperature in the processing facility dropped suddenly. Workers looked up from their stations, breath misting before their faces. Then they saw it. Hellfire tracing patterns across the walls, moving like a living thing, spelling out accusations in a language that transcended words. Murderer, slaver, guilty. Ghost Rider crashed through the facility's main entrance on his motorcycle, the burning wheels leaving permanent scorch marks on the Duracrete floor. Workers scattered, but the rider paid them no attention. His hollow eyes focused solely on Rakor, who was fumbling for an alarm button with trembling fingers. "Security!" Rakor screamed into his comlink. "We have an intruder. Code Red." A dozen armed guards rushed into the processing floor, blasters raised. They opened fire without hesitation, bolts of superheated plasma streaking toward Ghost Rider. The rider didn't slow. The blaster bolts either passed through him harmlessly or were absorbed by his hellfire, each shot making the flames burn brighter. The chain lashed out with serpentine precision, wrapping around weapons and wrenching them from guards' hands. Those who dropped their guns and raised their hands in surrender, the rider ignored. Their guilt was minor, desperate men taking desperate work. But 3 guards had blood on their hands from disciplining workers who tried to escape or organize. For them, judgment came swiftly. The Penance Stare took all 3 simultaneously. They experienced every beating they'd administered from their victims' perspectives. Every threat, every moment of fear they'd inflicted on beings trying to survive impossible circumstances. Their screams lasted 9 seconds before their souls ignited, consumed by hellfire that left only ash and the lingering smell of burned guilt. Rakor ran. His fortified booth had a back exit leading to a private turbo lift, his escape route for exactly this kind of emergency. He slammed the door behind him and punched the activation code. Relief flooding through him as the lift began to descend toward the deeper levels where even Imperial authority rarely ventured. The relief lasted 3 seconds. Hellfire erupted through the turbo lift's floor, melting through Durasteel as if it were paper. Ghost Rider rose through the opening, his burning form filling the confined space. Rakor pressed himself into the corner, whimpering. "Please," he gasped. "I can pay you. Credits, spice, anything. Name your price." "Your guilt has already named the price," Ghost Rider said. 47 workers dead from negligence. 83 more permanently damaged by chemical exposure. Children working in toxic environments because you found their small hands useful. Threats, beatings, sexual exploitation, all to increase profit margins by 3%. They're just undercity trash. Nobody cares about them. I care. The rider's hand shot forward, gripping Rakor's face. Look into my eyes. The Penance Stare was absolute and merciless. Rakor experienced every death he'd caused, every injury, every moment of despair inflicted on beings who had no power to resist. When it ended 30 seconds later, his soul burned away completely, leaving only a scorched outline on the turbolift wall. Ghost Rider returned to the processing facility to find the workers staring at him with expressions mixing terror and hope. An elderly Twi'lek woman stepped forward cautiously, her leku scarred from years of chemical exposure. "What are you?" she asked in Basic, her voice hoarse from inhaling toxic fumes. "Judgment," Ghost Rider answered. "The guilty have been removed. You are free to go." "Free?" A human worker laughed bitterly. "Free to starve? Free to be picked up by another operation just like this one?" "The Undercity doesn't do free, monster. It does survival, and we were surviving." The rider paused, and Johnny Blaze's consciousness stirred within their shared form. He's right. We're not solving the problem, just punishing symptoms. Without Rakor, someone worse might take over. Without this operation, these people have no income. Innocence must be protected, the rider insisted. Guilt must be punished. That is the law. But what about after? What happens to them after we burn away the guilty? The question hung in the air, unanswered. Ghost Rider had never needed to consider aftermath before. Judgment was absolute. Consequence was the survivor's concern. But something about this galaxy's scale, the systemic nature of its evil, made the usual approach feel insufficient. "There are credits in Rakor's accounts," the rider said finally. "Enough to sustain you until you find better circumstances. The codes are in his booth." It wasn't redemption, wasn't systemic change, but it was something more than simple vengeance. The workers exchanged glances, uncertain whether to trust this burning entity that killed with a look but spoke of their survival. Eventually, practical need overcame fear. They moved toward Rakor's booth to claim what their dead overseer had stolen from them over years of exploitation. Ghost Rider departed, leaving the processing facility behind. But Johnny's question echoed. What happens after judgment? The question became more urgent as the rider moved through the Undercity, encountering a landscape of complicated guilt. A mother who had stolen food to feed her children, guilty, but the alternative was watching them starve. A former Imperial deserter who had killed his commanding officer to prevent a massacre of civilians, guilty of murder, but the officer's death had saved hundreds. A gang enforcer who protected his neighborhood from worse predators through violence, guilty of brutality, but without him, the vulnerable would be helpless. The Undercity existed in shades of gray that challenged the rider's absolute judgment. Innocence and guilt intertwined so thoroughly that burning away the latter might destroy the former. This galaxy is different, Johnny thought. In our world, the lines were clearer. Demons, criminals, corrupt officials, the guilty stood out. Here, the entire system is guilty. The Empire built corruption into the foundation. Poverty forces people into choices between types of evil. How do we judge a galaxy where survival itself creates guilt? The rider's response was silence, and in that silence, something fundamental shifted. The spirit of vengeance had operated on absolute principles for millennia. But this galaxy's complexity introduced doubt, not in the righteousness of judgment, but in its application. Ghost Rider emerged from the Undercity onto level 2850, where mid-level Imperial bureaucrats lived in modest comfort, far from the spires, but well above the depths. These were the beings who implemented the Empire's policies without question, who signed forms that resulted in oppression, who enabled tyranny through banal adherence to cruel regulations. An apartment complex housed 300 such bureaucrats. Ghost Rider could sense their collective guilt. Nothing as dramatic as mass murder, but thousands of small evils that accumulated into institutional atrocity. Families separated by immigration policy, businesses destroyed by arbitrary regulation, citizens reported to authorities for minor infractions that resulted in imprisonment or death. The Rider stood before the complex Hellfire building around him, preparing to dispense judgment on beings who had never pulled a trigger or swung a blade, but whose clerical work had destroyed countless lives. If we burn them all, who's left to run the galaxy? Johnny asked. If we judge every being who's participated in the Empire's systems, even through paperwork, we'll consume billions, tens of billions. And what then? Does the galaxy collapse? Do more innocents die in the chaos? Evil must have consequences. I'm not arguing against consequences. I'm asking if consumption is the only consequence that matters. The debate was interrupted by the arrival of beings the Rider hadn't expected to encounter. Jedi. Two figures emerged from the shadows, moving with the distinctive grace of Force users. One was human, middle-aged, his robes worn but clean. The other was a Togruta, younger, her montrals marking her as from Shili. Both carried lightsabers at their belts, but made no move to draw them. "We mean no aggression," the human said, hands raised in a peaceful gesture. "I am Rohan Fel, formerly a Jedi Knight. This is my companion, Alia Kree. We've been tracking your progress through Coruscant." Ghost Rider's Hellfire intensified, scanning them for guilt. The Rider found it, but different from Imperial evil. These two carried the weight of failure, of surviving when others died, of hiding while the Empire hunted their order to extinction. "You are guilty of cowardice," the Rider stated. "Your brothers and sisters died. You fled. You survived while innocents perished." Rohan flinched but held his ground. "Yes, we ran. We hid. We failed to protect those we swore to defend. If you've come to judge us for that, we won't resist. But first, we ask that you listen. The guilty do not dictate judgment's terms." "Perhaps not," Alia said, her voice steady despite obvious fear. "But the galaxy's survival might require you to understand context before you burn everything to ash." Ghost Rider's Hellfire dimmed slightly, not in acceptance, but in curiosity. These beings weren't begging for mercy or claiming innocence. They acknowledged their guilt, but suggested judgment required understanding. It was a novel approach. "Speak," the Rider commanded. "But know that words will not absolve sin." Rohan gestured toward the apartment complex. "The beings in that building, you sense their guilt, yes? The policies they implement, the forms they sign, the cruel efficiency of Empire bureaucracy? Their guilt is evident." "It is," Rohan agreed. "But if you kill them, who replaces them? Other bureaucrats, possibly worse. Or chaos, while the Empire installs new administrators. The system continues regardless. You would burn away individual guilt while leaving the structure that creates it intact. Then I will burn the structure as well." "To ash?" Alia challenged. "You'll burn the Empire's infrastructure? And what fills the void?" "The Empire has 1,000,000 worlds under its control. Its supply chains feed billions. Its communication networks connect the galaxy. Its military, evil as it is, maintains a stability that prevents total war between systems. Destroy it all in flames, and the innocent suffer most." The Force showed us a vision, Roan continued, of you standing triumphant on a galaxy of ash, every guilty being consumed, and around you nothing but corpses and ruins. The innocent survived your judgment, but they inherited a wasteland. No infrastructure, no trade, no communication, just billions of beings scattered across a shattered galaxy, dying slowly of starvation and disease, because the systems that sustained them burned with the guilty. Ghost Rider's Hellfire pulsed uncertainly. You suggest the guilty should go unpunished to preserve order? No, Roan said firmly. We suggest that judgment without wisdom is just another form of destruction. The guilty should face consequences. But perhaps not all consequences require consumption. Perhaps some require change, redemption, or... There is no redemption for innocent blood, the rider interrupted. Once spilled, it cries out forever. Justice demands payment. Does justice demand the death of everyone in this galaxy? Alaya asked quietly. Because that's where your path leads. The Empire is guilty. The rebellion has committed atrocities in the name of resistance. The Jedi failed catastrophically. The criminal underworld exploits the vulnerable. Even the innocent carry small guilts, small lies, minor thefts, moments of cruelty or cowardice. If you judge absolutely, you'll burn everything. The word struck at the core of Johnny Blaze's internal argument. The spirit of vengeance existed to punish evil, but in a galaxy where evil was systemic, where survival often required compromise with corruption, absolute judgment became absolute destruction. They're right, Johnny thought. We're powerful enough to burn this galaxy to cinders. But should we? Is that actually justice, or just apocalypse with a righteous brand? The rider's response was not immediate. For the first time since arriving in this dimension, the spirit of vengeance experienced something approaching doubt about its fundamental purpose. What would you have me do? Ghost Rider asked, and the question itself was unprecedented. The spirit of vengeance did not ask for guidance. It simply judged and executed. Hunt the worst first, Roan suggested. The architects of genocide, the true monsters, those whose guilt is so vast that their removal might actually improve the galaxy. Give the lesser guilty a chance to change, to make amends, to choose differently. And if they do not change, then they face judgment, Aliyah said. But let it be judgment with purpose, not just consumption. Let it be justice that creates a better galaxy, not just an emptier one. Ghost Rider stood silent. The internal debate between Johnny's humanity and the rider's absolute purpose reaching a critical juncture. The apartment building's bureaucrats watched from their windows, unaware that their fates hung in the balance of a conversation about the nature of justice itself. Finally, the rider spoke. I will consider your words, but know this. The truly guilty will burn regardless. The architects of this empire's evil, those who built machinery of oppression and those who operate it without conscience, they will face judgment. No philosophical argument will save them. We wouldn't ask for that, Roan said. Some beings are beyond redemption, but most beings are complicated, carrying both guilt and the potential for better choices. Perhaps judgment can account for that complexity. Ghost Rider turned from the apartment complex, his decision made, not to spare the guilty, but to prioritize. The worst offenders first, the architects of suffering, the beings whose removal might actually allow change rather than just creating a vacuum. As the rider departed on his burning motorcycle, Aklia turned to Roan. Do you think it understood? I think, Roan said slowly, that we just negotiated with a cosmic force of vengeance, and it listened. that's more than I hoped for. Or we've just directed it toward larger targets, the Emperor, Vader, the Grand Moffs. When it starts hunting them specifically, the entire galaxy will burn. Perhaps, Roan acknowledged. But at least the galaxy will still exist afterward. If we hadn't intervened, it was going to burn anyway. Just completely, with nothing left but ash and regret. They melted back into the shadows, 2 Jedi survivors in a galaxy that had tried to exterminate their kind, now wondering if they just unleashed something worse than the Empire, or found an unlikely ally in the fight for a better future. Ghost Rider raced through Coruscant's night, the Hellfire burning brighter than ever, but now directed with purpose rather than absolute fury. The guilty would still burn, but the galaxy itself might survive the purge. The question was, would the truly guilty allow themselves to be hunted? Or would they fight back with every weapon the Empire possessed? The answer came within the hour, broadcast on every Imperial frequency across Coruscant. Grand Moff Tarkin had arrived aboard the Death Star, and the Emperor had ordered the battle station to assume orbit above the capital. A weapons demonstration was scheduled for the following day. Ghost Rider looked up at the stars, where a moon-sized station of ultimate destruction floated in orbit, and the Hellfire responded with recognition. So much guilt aboard that station. So many beings who had participated in genocide, who had built a weapon designed to destroy entire worlds. The spirit of vengeance had found its next target, and the Death Star had no idea what was coming for it. The Death Star hung in orbit above Coruscant like a mechanized moon, its gray surface reflecting the planet's city lights in patterns that suggested circuitry rather than geography. Aboard the battle station, Grand Moff Wilhuff Tarkin stood in the overbridge, hands clasped behind his back, observing the capital world below with the detached satisfaction of a man who commanded ultimate power. The entity continues its rampage through the lower levels, Admiral Mahdi reported, consulting a data pad. 17 more casualties in the Undercity, mostly criminal elements and corrupt officials. A pest control service, then, Tarkin said dryly, though one with unfortunate targeting algorithms. The Emperor wishes this creature eliminated before it becomes emboldened enough to strike at actual Imperial authority. With respect, sir, it has already killed over 100 Imperial personnel across multiple facilities. Middle management and facility overseers, Tarkin dismissed. Replaceable. I refer to actual authority, governors, moffs, admirals, the beings who shape Imperial policy rather than merely implement it. Do you believe it would dare attack someone of your station, sir? Tarkin's thin lips curved in something approximating a smile. I believe it operates on principles we don't yet fully understand, which is why we're conducting a demonstration tomorrow. If this creature values innocent life as reports suggest, it will respond predictably when we threaten Coruscant's population centers. Then we can assess its capabilities under controlled conditions. What Tarkin didn't know, couldn't know, was that Ghost Rider was already aboard the Death Star. The Rider had arrived via supply transport, his presence masked by the sheer concentration of guilt emanating from the battle station. Over 1 million Imperial personnel worked aboard the Death Star, and a significant percentage carried blood on their hands. Engineers who had built the super laser knowing its purpose, officers who had participated in the destruction of Alderaan, gunners who had vaporized civilian vessels for target practice. The station itself seemed to pulse with accumulated sin, its corridors echoing with the screams of the 2 billion Alderaanians who had died when Tarkin ordered their world destroyed. Ghost Rider moved through the maintenance levels, his Hellfire dimmed to avoid immediate detection, sensing the guilt that saturated every bulkhead. This place is an abomination, Johnny thought. They built a weapon specifically designed to commit genocide, and over 1 million people helped make it possible. They are all guilty, the writer agreed. Every being who contributed to this machine shares responsibility for its victims. That's 1 million souls. Can we actually consume that many? We will try. In a tertiary maintenance junction on level 357, the writer encountered a young technician named Jace Varian. The man was replacing a power coupling, his movements practiced and efficient. Ghost Rider materialized from the shadows, Hellfire illuminating the narrow corridor. Jace spun, nearly dropping his hydrospanner. What the? Security! We have an intruder in... You are guilty. Ghost Rider interrupted. The rider's senses probed the technician's soul, finding the expected stains. Jace had worked on the super laser array's focusing crystals. He had known what the weapon would be used for. He had continued anyway because the pay was exceptional and refusing meant reassignment to a penal battalion. But the guilt was complicated. Jace hadn't wanted to participate. He'd tried to sabotage his work subtly, introducing minor inefficiencies that would degrade the weapon's performance by fractions of a percent. Not enough to be noticed, but enough to satisfy his conscience slightly. And he'd been sending half his salary to refugee organizations helping Alderaanian survivors. A meager attempt at restitution for his participation in their world's destruction. The Penance Stare took him anyway. Jace experienced Alderaan's destruction from the perspective of a single victim. A schoolteacher named Mara Ven, who had been conducting a lesson on galactic history when the super laser struck. He felt her confusion as every student in her classroom suddenly screamed in unison, felt the planet shudder, felt the atmosphere ignite and the ground begin to crack. He experienced her final thought as molecular bonds failed and matter itself was converted to energy. I hope someone remembers we existed. The stare released him. Jace collapsed, gasping, alive but fundamentally changed. His soul had been judged and found guilty, but the rider had not consumed him. The attempt at sabotage, the donations, the genuine remorse, these provided the thinnest possible mitigation. You live, Ghost Rider said, but you carry Alderaan's memory now. You will spend your existence ensuring no world ever burns like that again, or I will return to finish judgment. Jace nodded frantically, unable to speak, tears streaming down his face as Alderaan's death played repeatedly in his memory. The rider moved deeper into the Death Star, and the pattern repeated. Engineers who had worked on the station found themselves experiencing the Penance Stare, forced to confront what their technical expertise had enabled. Some survived, their partial guilt and genuine remorse providing narrow salvation. Others, those who had taken pride in their work, who had celebrated Alderaan's destruction, who felt no remorse whatsoever, burned to ash, their souls consumed by hellfire that left no trace beyond scorch marks on bulkheads. Alarms began sounding as the disappearances mounted. Security teams deployed, sweeping sections where personnel had vanished. They found only burn marks and witnesses babbling about a flaming demon that judged souls. On the overbridge, Admiral Mahdi received the reports with increasing alarm. Sir, we have over 30 missing personnel across multiple decks. Witnesses describe an entity matching reports from Coruscant, some kind of burning humanoid that kills with sustained eye contact. Tarkin's expression remained impassive. The creature has boarded my station. How enterprising. He activated the internal communication system. Attention all personnel. We are conducting a security drill. All non-essential crew are to return to quarters immediately. Security teams are authorized to use lethal force against any unauthorized entities. Sir, lethal force has proven ineffective against this creature. Then security will serve as bait while we observe its behavior, Tarkin said coldly. Have sensors track its movements. I want to know where it's going and what it wants. Ghost Rider's path through the Death Star followed the concentration of guilt like a bloodhound following scent. The rider moved inexorably toward the command levels, where the architects of genocide worked and planned the destruction of additional worlds. Lesser guilty beings were left with either the Penance Stare as warning or death as judgment, depending on the depth of their crimes and presence of mitigating factors. In the detention level, the rider discovered something unexpected. Prisoners. Not all cells held rebel operatives or political dissidents. Some contained Imperial personnel who had refused orders, whistleblowers who had tried to expose the Death Star's true purpose, conscientious objectors who had been court-martialed rather than participate in atrocity. Ghost Rider melted the cell locks with Hellfire, freeing beings who stared at their liberator with expressions mixing terror and gratitude. You are innocent, the rider declared. Or innocent enough. The escape pods are on Deck 84. Use them before this station burns. Burns? A freed rebel operative asked. You're going to destroy the Death Star? I am going to destroy the guilty, Ghost Rider corrected. If the station cannot function without them, then yes, it will burn. The freed prisoners fled toward the escape pods, and Ghost Rider continued upward. The path led inevitably to the overbridge, where Tarkin waited with the cold patience of a man accustomed to controlling every variable. The rider emerged onto the command deck through a maintenance access, Hellfire heralding his arrival. Officers scattered, some drawing blasters despite knowing they were useless. Tarkin remained at his position, hands still clasped behind his back, observing the entity with clinical interest. The infamous entity, Tarkin said, his voice carrying across the overbridge despite not being raised. You've caused quite the disruption to Imperial operations. You are Wilhuff Tarkin, Ghost Rider stated, the name carrying the weight of accusation. Architect of the Tarkin Doctrine, destroyer of Alderaan, butcher of Ryloth. Your guilt spans star systems. Guilt is a provincial concept, Tarkin replied, utterly unintimidated. I have done what was necessary to maintain order in a chaotic galaxy. 2 billion Alderaanians died, so that trillions would not be tempted toward rebellion. If that decision troubles your sense of morality, then I submit your morality is inadequate for galactic governance. The Hellfire intensified, responding to Tarkin's complete absence of remorse. You feel no guilt for what you have done. None whatsoever. I sleep soundly, secure in the knowledge that my actions serve the greater good of Imperial Order. Tarkin's expression never wavered. You judge beings by their guilt, I'm told? But what judgment can you pass on someone who has transcended such pedestrian concerns? I made my choices with full awareness of their costs. I would make them again. Your supernatural moral certainty means nothing to me. Ghost Rider advanced, chain uncoiling. Then you will experience what you have inflicted. Look into my eyes. I think not. Tarkin pressed a button on his command console. The overbridge's blast shield slammed down, separating Tarkin from Ghost Rider behind transparasteel designed to withstand capital ship weaponry. Simultaneously, the deck depressurized, atmosphere venting into space through emergency airlocks that opened with violent force. Imperial officers caught in the decompression were sucked toward the void, screaming, Ghost Rider's chain lashed out, catching them before they could be expelled into vacuum, Hellfire forming a barrier that sealed the breaches. The Rider existed outside conventional physics. Vacuum was no more threatening than atmosphere. Tarkin watched from his sealed command booth, impressed despite himself. Remarkable. It protects even my officers while attempting to kill me. Such predictable nobility. The Grand Moff activated another control. Heavy weapon emplacements emerged from the overbridge's walls, not blasters, but experimental anti-force weapons developed specifically for use against Jedi. They fired waves of sonic disruption and electromagnetic pulses designed to overwhelm force-sensitive nervous systems. The weapons hit Ghost Rider directly, and for a moment seemed effective. The Hellfire flickered, dimming. But the Rider was not force-sensitive. The spirit of vengeance operated on cosmic principles that superseded local energy fields. After 3 seconds of disruption, the Hellfire burned through the interference, consuming the weapons themselves and melting them to slag. Interesting, Tarkin murmured. Not force-based then. Dimensional intrusion, perhaps? Or divine manifestation? He activated his comm link. Admiral Mahdi, initiate protocol Omega-7. Throughout the Death Star, bulkhead doors sealed, dividing the station into isolated segments. In each segment, atmosphere was replaced with a mixture of gases designed to ignite when exposed to extreme heat. Tarkin was willing to sacrifice thousands of his own personnel to destroy this entity. Ghost Rider sensed the trap instantly, sensed the innocent and partially guilty beings throughout the station who would die if his Hellfire triggered the atmospheric ignition. The Rider could survive the explosion, but those he judged worthy of life could not. He's using them as shields, Johnny realized. He knows we won't let innocents burn. Then we remove him without Hellfire. The chain lashed out, not wreathed in flames, but moving with purely physical force. It struck the transparent steel barrier and cracked it, spiderweb fractures spreading across the surface. Tarkin's expression finally showed a flicker of concern. Impressive dedication, he said, backing toward a secondary exit. But ultimately futile. Even if you kill me, the Empire continues. Another Grand Moff assumes command. The Death Star remains operational. You change nothing except removing one piece from a board containing millions. Your death is not about changing the Empire, Ghost Rider said, winding up for another strike. It is about justice for Alderaan, for Ryloth, for every world that burned, because you believed fear was more valuable than life. The chain struck again, and the barrier shattered. Ghost Rider surged forward, crossing the distance to Tarkin in a heartbeat. The Grand Moff drew a holdout blaster and fired directly into the Rider's skull. The bolt passed through harmlessly, and Tarkin found himself staring into hollow eye sockets burning with Hellfire. "Look into my eyes," the Rider commanded. And this time, there was no escape. The Penance Stare took Wilhuff Tarkin with the force of a collapsing star. He experienced Alderaan's destruction from 2 billion perspectives simultaneously. Every man, woman, and child who had died when he gave the order. He felt their confusion, their terror, their final desperate hopes that someone would save them. He felt parents trying to shield children from destruction that could not be stopped. He felt children calling for parents who were already dead. He felt the planetary crust liquefy, felt the atmosphere ignite, felt 2 billion souls cry out in the Force and then fall silent. But Alderaan was merely the beginning. The Penance Stare pulled him through decades of calculated cruelty, the bombardment of Ryloth that killed millions to punish rebellion, the destruction of civilian vessels to demonstrate Imperial power, the execution of prisoners who had surrendered in good faith, the systematic erasure of cultures that didn't conform to Imperial standards. Tarkin experienced every death he had ordered, every life destroyed by policies he had crafted, every family torn apart by doctrines bearing his name. And throughout it all, he felt what his victims felt. Betrayed by leaders who should have protected them, abandoned by a galaxy that wouldn't intervene, desperate for justice that would never come. The stare lasted 90 seconds, an eternity in subjective experience. When it ended, Wilhuff Tarkin stood frozen, his face locked in an expression of existential horror. His soul, judged and found guilty beyond redemption, ignited from within. The Hellfire consumed him completely, leaving only ash that scattered across the overbridge floor. The architect of the Tarkin doctrine, the destroyer of worlds, the man who believed fear was the ultimate governing principle, reduced to carbon and memory. Ghost Rider stood over the remains, feeling no triumph. Justice was not meant to be celebrated. It simply was. Tarkin had faced what he had done and been found wanting. The guilty had burned, but the Death Star still functioned. And throughout its corridors, thousands more guilty beings worked, maintaining this monument to genocide. We can't kill them all, Johnny thought, not without setting off Tarkin's trap and killing the innocents too. Then we do not kill them. We destroy the station itself. How? This thing is the size of a small moon. Even our Hellfire can't burn through that much durasteel and superstructure. We do not need to burn through it. We need only burn its heart. Ghost Rider raced through the Death Star's corridors, following the schematic sense that came with supernatural perception. The station's heart was its reactor, a hypermatter annihilation core that generated enough power to fuel the superlaser. If that core was destabilized, the station would tear itself apart from within. Security teams tried to stop the Riders' progress, but their efforts were futile. Blast doors melted, weapon emplacements were torn from their moorings by the chain. Those who surrendered or fled were spared. Those who stood their ground died, their guilt measured and found sufficient for consumption. The reactor level was defended by the Death Star's most elite troops. Stormtroopers trained specifically for internal security, equipped with weapons designed to stop Force users. They formed a defensive line outside the reactor control room, determined to stop this entity even if it cost their lives. Ghost Rider paused before engaging them, sensing their souls. Many were guilty. Participants in Alderaan's destruction, enforcers of brutal suppression, soldiers who had committed atrocities across the galaxy. But some were simply soldiers, following orders without full awareness of what they served, their guilt more abstract than personal. "Stand aside," the rider commanded. "This station is an abomination. It will be destroyed. You can live through its destruction in escape pods, or die defending genocide." "We have our orders," the lead trooper said, his voice distorted through his helmet speakers. "This station represents Imperial power. We will defend it." "Then you die for a lie." Ghost Rider's chain whipped forward. The battle was brief and brutal. Troopers who dropped their weapons and fled were spared. Those who fought found themselves facing judgment. The Penance Stare taking some, Hellfire consuming others, the chain breaking still more. Within 90 seconds, the defensive line had collapsed, and Ghost Rider stood before the reactor control room. Inside, the hypermatter core hummed with barely contained energy, its magnetic containment fields keeping annihilation reactions from consuming the entire station. Ghost Rider's Hellfire reached out, probing the reactor systems, understanding its function through supernatural intuition. "If we breach the containment," Johnny warned, "everyone aboard dies. There are still innocents here, people who haven't made it to escape pods yet. Then we give them time." Ghost Rider accessed the station's communication system, his voice echoing through every corridor, deck, and compartment. "This station has been judged and found guilty. All personnel have 15 minutes to reach escape pods before the reactor destabilizes. The innocent will be given time to flee. The guilty who remain will share the station's fate." Chaos erupted throughout the Death Star as personnel stampeded toward escape pods. Some fled out of simple survival instinct. Others fled because they carried guilt and feared judgment. A few remained, either through duty, defiance, or disbelief that this entity could actually destroy the Empire's ultimate weapon. Ghost Rider counted down 15 minutes with perfect precision. During that time, he held the reactor stable through sheer force of will, his Hellfire intertwining with the containment fields to prevent premature detonation. Escape pods launched by the hundreds, fleeing the battle station like seeds from a dying plant. When the 15 minutes elapsed, Ghost Rider released the containment fields. The hypermatter core destabilized instantly. Annihilation reactions spread through the reactor chamber, converting matter directly to energy. Failsafes designed to prevent catastrophic failure melted away under forces they had never been designed to contain. The chain reaction accelerated, and in the space of 3 seconds, the Death Star's reactor went critical. Ghost Rider rode the initial explosion outward, his motorcycle manifesting around him, Hellfire providing protection from energies that would have vaporized planets. Behind him, the Death Star, the Empire's ultimate weapon, the symbol of Tarkin's doctrine, the machine that had destroyed Alderaan, tore itself apart. The explosion was visible from Coruscant's surface, a second sun blooming in orbit before fading. Billions watched as the battle station that had represented Imperial invincibility disintegrated, its fragments raining down into the planet's atmosphere, where they burned up harmlessly. In his throne room, Emperor Palpatine felt the disturbance in the Force, not the Death Star's destruction, which was merely material, but the consumption of Tarkin's soul. The Grand Moff's guilt, accumulated over decades, had provided enough energy to fuel the entity's hellfire for months. "Lord Vader," Palpatine said quietly into his comlink, "the situation has escalated beyond acceptable parameters. Implement Protocol Crimson." On the Executor, Vader acknowledged the command with a sense of grim inevitability. Protocol Crimson meant total war against the entity. All resources, all options, no restrictions. The Empire would treat Ghost Rider not as a criminal or rebel, but as an existential threat requiring extinction at any cost. The hunt had officially begun, and as Ghost Rider descended back toward Coruscant's surface, the Hellfire burning brighter than ever, fueled by Tarkin's consumed guilt and the righteous destruction of a genocide weapon, the spirit of vengeance prepared for the war to come. The guilty would burn, all of them, even if it meant facing the full might of the Galactic Empire. The destruction of the Death Star sent shockwaves through the galaxy that transcended mere military implications. On Imperial worlds, the news was suppressed or spun as a rebel terrorist attack. On rebel-held territories, celebrations erupted until the true cause became known. Not alliance heroism, but something far more unsettling. And in the underworld, criminal syndicates and independent operators watched with calculating interest as the Empire's invincibility shattered. But it was within the Rebel Alliance itself that the entity's actions created the deepest schism. On Yavin 4, in the jungle-covered temple that served as the rebellion's headquarters, Mon Mothma convened an emergency session of Alliance High Command. General John Dodonna, Princess Leia Organa, and a dozen other leaders gathered around the holographic display showing the Death Star's destruction for the 15th time. "We should be celebrating," General Reactor said, but his tone suggested confusion rather than joy. "The Death Star is gone. Tarkin is dead. The Empire's ultimate weapon has been eliminated. By something we don't understand and can't control," Mon Mothma countered, her usually serene expression troubled. "This entity, this Ghost Rider, operates without coordination, without strategy, without any consideration for galactic stability. It simply burns whoever it deems guilty." Leia leaned forward, her dark eyes intense. "Tarkin was guilty. The Death Star was an abomination. Perhaps we should view this entity as an ally, even if unconventional." "An ally?" Admiral Akbar's voice carried skepticism. "It hasn't contacted us, hasn't coordinated with our operations, hasn't shown any interest in the rebellion's cause. It simply kills, according to its own judgment." "Which raises the critical question," Mon Mothma said quietly. "Would it judge us as well?" The silence that followed was heavy with uncomfortable truths. The rebellion fought for freedom and justice, but war made monsters of everyone. Alliance operatives had sabotaged Imperial facilities knowing civilians would die as collateral damage. Rebel cells had assassinated governors and officials, some guilty of atrocity, but others merely competent administrators. The destruction of the Death Star above Scarif had killed tens of thousands of Imperial personnel, many of them conscripts and support staff who had never fired a shot. "We've done what was necessary," Leia said, but her voice lacked conviction. "Everything we've done has been in service of ending the Empire's tyranny." Tarkin believed the same about his actions, Mon Mothma observed, that everything he did served the greater good of galactic order. If this entity judges based on innocent blood spilled regardless of justification, then many of us would be found wanting. The strategic implications were staggering. The rebellion couldn't afford to fight both the Empire and a supernatural entity that might target them for war crimes committed in pursuit of liberation. But they also couldn't ignore an opportunity. Ghost Rider had accomplished in days what the Alliance had failed to achieve in years, striking fear into the Empire's heart. "We need intelligence," Dodonna said. "We need to understand what this thing is, what it wants, and whether it can be negotiated with. Princess Leia, you have contacts in Coruscant's underground. Can we establish communication?" Leia nodded slowly. "I'll reach out to my network. But understand, we may not like what we learn. If this entity judges guilt without context, then the line between hero and villain becomes dangerously thin." On Coruscant, Ghost Rider moved through the mid-levels, following guilt trails that crisscrossed the planet like a web. The Rider's destruction of the Death Star had amplified his presence. Every guilty being within 1,000 light years could feel judgment approaching, a subconscious dread that manifested as nightmares and paranoia. But the Rider had also attracted attention from beings who viewed guilt through more pragmatic lenses. In a cantina on level 1893, the Rider materialized to find 3 individuals waiting: a human woman with cyborg enhancements, a Deveronian male with ritualistic scarring, and a Twi'lek female whose Leku bore tattoos identifying her as a former Jedi Padawan. "We've been tracking you," the human said, her mechanical eye whirring as it focused on Ghost Rider. "I'm Kest Dameron, former Rebel intelligence operative. This is Kirvash, Independent Force user, and Sela, survivor of Order 66. We need to talk." Ghost Rider's Hellfire pulsed, scanning them. All three carried guilt. Kes had assassinated Imperial officials, some deserving death, others merely obstacles. Kirvash practiced force techniques that straddled the line between light and dark, his powers fueled by controlled aggression. Sela had survived the Jedi purge by betraying the location of a Jedi safe house, sacrificing 12 to save herself. "You are all guilty," the rider stated. "Yes," Kes agreed without hesitation. "We've all done terrible things. I've killed people. Kirvash has tortured for information. Ciela gave up her fellow Jedi to Vader himself. We're not here to claim innocence. We're here to offer perspective. Guilt does not negotiate." "Maybe not," Sela said, her voice carrying the weight of years of self-recrimination. "But judgment without wisdom is just violence. You destroyed the Death Star. Good. Tarkin deserved what he got. But what's your endgame? You keep burning the guilty, and where does it stop?" Ghost Rider's Hellfire dimmed slightly. The question echoed Johnny Blaze's internal concerns. "It stops when the guilty have been judged." "All of them?" Kirvash's scarred face twisted in a grim smile. "Because in this galaxy, that's everyone. The Emperor built an empire on the bones of the Republic, but the Republic was corrupt long before Palpatine. The Jedi failed to prevent the war, failed to see the Sith manipulation, failed to adapt when the galaxy needed them. The rebellion commits atrocities in the name of freedom. The criminal underworld exploits the vulnerable. Where's the line between guilty and innocent when everyone has blood on their hands?" He's right, Johnny thought. This galaxy isn't like home. There's no clear division between good and evil. Just people making choices in impossible circumstances. Evil remains evil regardless of circumstance, the rider insisted. But the certainty had weakened. "You judged me," Sela continued, "and found me guilty. I am. I betrayed my order to save my own life. 12 Jedi died because of my cowardice. But in the years since, I've dedicated myself to protecting Force-sensitive children from the Inquisitors. I've saved 37 younglings from certain death, placed them with families who can hide them. Does that balance the scales? Am I still guilty? Or have I earned some measure of redemption?" The question cut to the core of the rider's purpose. The spirit of vengeance existed to punish evil, not to weigh redemption. But this galaxy's complexity introduced variables that absolute judgment struggled to process. "Your redemption does not erase your crime," Ghost Rider said. "No," Sela agreed. "But does my crime erase my redemption? If you burn me now, those 37 children lose their protector. More Force-sensitives die. The galaxy becomes slightly darker. Is that justice, or just more death?" The rider stood silent, the internal debate between Johnny's humanity and the spirit's absolute purpose reaching a critical juncture. The Hellfire flickered uncertainly, caught between conviction and doubt. "We're not asking you to stop," Kes said. "We're asking you to be strategic. The Empire has millions of guilty beings. You can't burn them all, you'd be fighting for centuries. But if you prioritize the worst offenders, the architects of systematic evil, you could actually create change rather than just chaos." "The worst are already dying," Ghost Rider countered. "Tarkin is ash. His death changed nothing. The Empire continues." "Because you're treating symptoms instead of the disease," Kirvash said. "Tarkin was evil, yes, but he was also a tool of the Emperor. Palpatine is the source, the Sith Lord who orchestrated the Clone Wars, executed Order 66, built the Empire on genocide and oppression, kills Sidious, and the Empire fractures. The guilty still exist, but the structure that empowers them collapses. They're suggesting we assassinate the Emperor, Johnny realized. Use our power strategically instead of just burning through every guilty person we encounter. The Emperor's guilt is vast, the writer acknowledged. But so is Vader's, and he survived the Penance Stare. Sidious may be similarly immune. Then you find another way, Sela said. You're not just vengeance. You're also justice. And justice requires more than punishment. It requires creating conditions where evil becomes harder to commit. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Imperial forces. Stormtroopers poured into the cantina from multiple entrances, their movements coordinated and professional. These weren't ordinary troops. Their armor bore the insignia of the 501st Legion, Vader's personal battalion. "Stand down," the lead trooper commanded, blaster rifles trained on Ghost Rider. "You are under arrest by order of the Emperor for terrorism, mass murder, and crimes against the Empire." Ghost Rider's Hellfire exploded outward in response. The chain uncoiled, moving like a living serpent. But before violence could erupt, Kess raised her hands. "Wait," she said. "Let's not turn this into a massacre. Trooper, you really want to fight something that destroyed the Death Star?" The trooper hesitated, and in that moment of uncertainty, Sela reached out through the Force, not to attack, but to touch the minds of the stormtroopers. What she found surprised her. "They're afraid," she said quietly, "not just of the entity, but of failing. Vader promised them to their families personally if they failed to capture Ghost Rider. They're not fighting for the Empire, they're fighting to avoid punishment." The observation shifted Ghost Rider's perception. These troopers carried guilt. Participation in Imperial operations, enforcement of oppressive laws, violence against civilians. But they were also victims of the Empire's machinery, conscripts and recruits who had been indoctrinated, threatened, and forced into service. More complexity, Johnny thought. More shades of gray. At what point does following orders stop being guilt and start being survival? "Lower your weapons," Ghost Rider commanded the troopers. "I have no quarrel with beings forced into service. Walk away." "We can't," the lead trooper said, voice strained. "Lord Vader will kill us if we return without you." "Then you face a choice," the rider said. "Die here attempting to capture me, or desert and survive. The Empire has made you believe there are no other options. That is a lie." For a long moment, the cantina was frozen in tableau. Stormtroopers with weapons raised, Ghost Rider with Hellfire ready to burn, Kess and her companions positioned between them. Then, slowly, the lead trooper lowered his rifle. "They'll hunt us," he said. "The Empire doesn't tolerate desertion." "The Empire doesn't tolerate anything," Kess interjected. "But there are networks that protect defectors. The rebellion welcomes former Imperials who've seen the light. You don't have to die for Palpatine's lies." One by one, the stormtroopers lowered their weapons. It wasn't unanimous. 3 troopers maintained their firing positions, loyalty or fear overriding survival instinct. Ghost Rider's chain disarmed them with precise strikes, leaving them unconscious but alive. The deserters fled, and Kess provided them with codes that would connect them to rebel extraction networks. It wasn't redemption, they'd have to earn that through future actions. But it was a beginning. "You see?" Sela said to Ghost Rider. "That's what strategic judgment looks like. You didn't burn them, didn't consume their guilty souls. You gave them a chance to choose differently, and the galaxy becomes slightly less dark." Ghost Rider watched the troopers disappear into Coruscant's urban maze, and something fundamental shifted within the rider's consciousness. Johnny Blaze's humanity had been arguing for precisely this kind of nuance since arriving in this galaxy. Now, the spirit of vengeance itself began to acknowledge that absolute judgment might require absolute wisdom to be truly just. "The Emperor," the rider said finally. "You suggest targeting him specifically. What makes you believe I could succeed where the Jedi failed?" "Because you're not a Jedi," Kirvash answered. "You don't operate within the Force's rules. Palpatine has spent decades perfecting his ability to manipulate the Force, to hide within it, to use it as both weapon and shield. But you exist outside that paradigm. Your Hellfire doesn't care about Force lightning or Sith alchemy. You judge souls, not power levels. The Emperor's soul is vast darkness," Sela added. "Decades of evil concentrated into one being. If anyone deserves the Penance Stare, it's him. And unlike Vader, Sidious has never known doubt, never experienced genuine remorse. His guilt is pure, undiluted, absolute. He won't survive what you show him." "It makes sense," Johnny admitted. "We've been reacting following guilt wherever it leads. But if we target the source, remove Palpatine, the entire Empire's structure becomes vulnerable. We could actually create lasting change instead of just burning through an endless supply of guilty beings. But reaching the Emperor requires strategy beyond vengeance," the rider acknowledged. "He will be protected by layers of defense, warned of our approach. This requires planning, not simply following guilt trails." "We can help with that," Kess said. "The rebellion has been trying to assassinate Palpatine for years. We have intelligence on his defenses, his movements, his vulnerabilities, or at least what we think are vulnerabilities. Combined with your power, we might actually succeed." Ghost Rider stood silent, processing the implications. The spirit of vengeance had never worked with others before. Judgment was absolute, not collaborative. But this galaxy's complexity demanded adaptation. Absolute judgment without strategic application would simply burn forever, consuming the guilty while the structures that created them remained intact. "I will consider your proposal," the rider said finally. "But understand, my judgment is not negotiable. If I determine the Emperor is guilty, he will face the Penance Stare. No political considerations, no strategic timing, no mercy for convenience." "We wouldn't ask for any," Kess assured him. "Palpatine is guilty of everything you judge him for and more. We just want to make sure you reach him before his defenses kill you. Nothing in this galaxy can kill me." "Maybe not," Sela said quietly. "But the Emperor has resources beyond what you've encountered. Sith alchemy, ancient artifacts, forbidden techniques that predate the Jedi Order. He's had decades to prepare for threats like Jedi Masters and Sith rivals. Don't underestimate him just because you're not from this dimension." The warning carried weight. Ghost Rider had destroyed the Death Star and survived, had consumed dozens of guilty souls, had faced Vader and left him shaken. But the Emperor represented something different. Concentrated evil that had spent decades consolidating power and eliminating threats. The final confrontation would not be simple judgment. It would be war between supernatural vengeance and ancient Sith darkness. "We will speak again," Ghost Rider said. "Continue your protection of Force-sensitive children. Continue your resistance against the Empire. And prepare intelligence on the Emperor's location and defenses. When the time comes, I will strike." The rider departed, leaving Kess, Kirvash, and Sela alone in the damaged cantina. They exchanged glances, each processing what they'd just witnessed. A being of absolute judgment agreeing to strategy. to cooperation, to something approaching alliance. Did we just recruit a cosmic force of vengeance to the rebellion? Kes asked. More like we pointed a weapon of mass judgment at the Empire's heart, Kirvash corrected. Whether that makes us brilliant or insane remains to be seen. Probably both, Sela said. But if it works, if Ghost Rider actually kills Palpatine, then the galaxy changes forever. The question is what kind of change we're unleashing. As Ghost Rider raced through Coruscant's night, the Hellfire burning with renewed purpose, the spirit of vengeance contemplated strategy for the first time in its existence. The Emperor would burn. But burning him required more than following guilt trails and dispensing judgment. It required planning, timing, and coordination, with beings who understood this galaxy's intricacies. The hunt for Palpatine had begun, and when Ghost Rider finally reached the Emperor's throne, the confrontation would determine not just their fates, but the future of the entire galaxy. Emperor Palpatine stood before the vast transpersteel viewport in his throne room, observing Coruscant's glittering expanse with the calculating gaze of a being who had spent decades manipulating galactic destiny. The destruction of the Death Star had been inconvenient, but not catastrophic. Tarkin's loss was regrettable. Competent administrators were valuable. But ultimately, the Grand Moff had been a tool, and tools could be replaced. The entity itself, however, presented a problem of a different magnitude. Lord Vader? Palpatine said without turning, sensing his apprentice's approach through the Force. Your assessment. Vader knelt, his breathing echoing in the cavernous chamber. The entity operates outside conventional parameters, Master. It judges guilt and consumes souls. The Penance Stare forces victims to experience the suffering they've inflicted. Most beings are destroyed instantly. Those who survive are changed. You survived, because I already live with my crimes every moment. The Stare showed me nothing I haven't experienced through memory and the dark side. Vader's mechanical hands clenched. But the Emperor's guilt is far vaster than mine. Decades of manipulation, genocide on a galactic scale, the orchestration of the Clone Wars, Order 66. You suggest I am vulnerable to this creature's judgment? Palpatine's tone carried amusement rather than concern. I suggest caution, Master. This being exists outside the Force's normal rules. Our conventional advantages may not apply. Palpatine finally turned, his yellow eyes gleaming with dark calculation. Then, we must create new advantages. The entity can be studied, its patterns analyzed, its weaknesses exploited. Everything that exists can be controlled or destroyed. The question is merely methodology. He gestured, and a holographic display activated, showing Ghost Rider's movements through Coruscant over the past week. The pattern was clear. The entity followed concentrations of guilt, targeting the worst offenders first, before moving to lesser crimes. Predictable, once understood. The creature has a conscience, Palpatine observed. It protects innocence even at cost to itself. This is exploitable. We simply ensure that any confrontation occurs in circumstances where its power would harm those it seeks to protect. You would use civilians as shields? I would use every resource at my disposal, Palpatine corrected, including the entity's own morality. But there are other approaches, older methods, techniques that predate even the Sith Order's recorded history. The Emperor moved to an ornate chest, constructed of dark metal inscribed with symbols that seemed to writhe in peripheral vision. He opened it reverently, revealing artifacts that radiated wrongness even to Vader's corrupted senses. a Sith holocron shaped like a screaming face, a dagger forged from a fallen star, a sphere that pulsed with the captured essence of something that should not exist. The ancient Sith understood that some threats could not be defeated through conventional means, Palpatine explained. They developed rituals, bindings, techniques for dealing with entities from beyond, demons, cosmic horrors, beings that existed outside reality's normal constraints. Such knowledge has been lost to most, but I have spent decades recovering it. He selected the holocron, its surface cold enough to frost the air around it. This contains the teachings of Darth Nihilus, the Lord of Hunger, a Sith Lord who consumed entire planets through the Force, who became more void than being. His techniques for binding and devouring supernatural entities may prove applicable. Vader felt unease ripple through the dark side. Nihilus had been a monster even by Sith standards, a wound in the Force itself that consumed all life in its vicinity. The techniques required to emulate his power came with catastrophic costs. Master, such rituals require sacrifice. I am aware of the costs, Palpatine interrupted coldly, and I am willing to pay them. This entity threatens the Empire's stability. It has destroyed my ultimate weapon, killed valuable administrators, and inspired hope among the rebellion. Such threats must be eliminated, regardless of price. The Emperor activated the holocron, and Darth Nihilus's teachings poured forth, knowledge written in pain and void. Rituals that required not just dark side power, but genuine evil. Techniques that demanded the practitioner become something less than sentient and more than monster. Prepare the ritual chamber beneath the palace, Palpatine commanded. We will need subjects, beings with strong connections to the Force, whose sacrifice will fuel the binding. And Lord Vader? This entity has allies now. Rebel operatives, rogue Jedi, beings who believe they can weaponize it against the Empire. Eliminate them before they can coordinate an assault. Vader bowed, but as he turned to leave, doubt whispered through his thoughts. The Penance Stare had shown him his crimes from new perspectives, forced him to experience Padmé's death as she had, felt the youngling's betrayal and terror. The experience should have been purely torture. Yet some fragment of Anakin Skywalker had stirred during those visions, had remembered what it felt like to care about innocence, to value life over power. That fragment was dangerous. It was weak. It threatened everything Vader had become, but it would not be silenced. In the Undercity, Ghost Rider met with Kess, Kirvash, and Sela again, this time in the abandoned Jedi Temple library that had somehow survived the purge. Ancient texts lined the walls, knowledge the Empire had overlooked or deemed worthless, philosophy and history from when the Jedi served the galaxy rather than merely guarding it. The Emperor is preparing something, Sela said, her connection to the Force allowing her to sense disturbances in the cosmic fabric. Dark side rituals on a scale I've never felt before. He's not just defending against you. He's weaponizing ancient Sith knowledge. What kind of knowledge? Ghost Rider asked. The kind that predates the rule of two, Kirvash answered, his scarred face grim. When the Sith were numerous and competed for power through increasingly horrific experiments, some Sith Lords became so consumed by darkness that they stopped being beings and became phenomena, wounds in reality, voids that consumed rather than created. The entity he's studying is called Darth Nihilus, Sela continued, accessing a datapad containing fragmentary historical records. A Sith Lord from 4,000 years ago who became so hungry for Force energy that he consumed entire planets. He developed techniques for binding and devouring supernatural entities. He believes he can consume me. Ghost Rider's statement carried no fear, only recognition of the threat. Or bind you, Kes said. Ancient Sith were experts at enslaving beings more powerful than themselves. They'd trap demons, force entities, even aspects of death itself into servitude. If Palpatine succeeds in binding you, he wouldn't just neutralize the threat. He'd gain your power. Imagine the Penance Stare used as an Imperial weapon, Hellfire deployed against the rebellion, judgment enslaved to tyranny. The implications were staggering. Ghost Rider had never encountered beings capable of binding the spirit of vengeance. Johnny Blaze's human soul could be trapped or manipulated, but the Rider itself was cosmic force beyond mortal control. Yet this galaxy operated on different principles, with the Force providing capabilities that might succeed where others had failed. Can he actually do it? Johnny wondered. Can the Emperor bind us? Unknown, the Rider admitted. This galaxy's power structure is alien to us. The Force may provide leverage we do not anticipate. Then we strike first, Kes said. Hit him before he completes his ritual. We have intelligence suggesting he's conducting preparations in a hidden chamber beneath the Imperial Palace. If we can reach him there, while he's focused on his ritual rather than defense. It's a trap, Kirvash interrupted. Obviously, a trap. Palpatine knows you're coming. He's prepared defenses, contingencies, and probably expects you to attack during the ritual because that's when he'll be most prepared. So we don't attack during the ritual, Sela suggested. We attack before, disrupt his preparations, destroy the artifacts he needs, eliminate the subjects he intends to sacrifice. Ghost Rider considered the strategic implications. The spirit of vengeance had always operated through direct confrontation. Find the guilty, judge them, consume them. But this situation demanded subtlety, timing, an understanding that sometimes the righteous path required patience rather than immediate vengeance. What does he need for the ritual? The Rider asked. Sela consulted her datapad. According to historical records, Nihilus's binding techniques required 3 components: artifacts of power to focus the ritual, force-sensitive subjects to fuel it through sacrifice, and a location saturated with dark side energy to anchor the binding. The Emperor has artifacts, Kes said. Decades of collecting Sith holocrons and forbidden knowledge. He has location. The Imperial Palace sits on the ruins of the old Jedi Temple, and he's been corrupting that space for years. What he needs is subjects, force-sensitive beings to sacrifice. He'll use prisoners. Vader's voice spoke from the shadows. The Dark Lord of the Sith emerged into the library's dim light, his imposing form seeming to absorb what little illumination existed. Kes, Kirvash, and Sela reacted instantly, hands moving toward weapons, the Force gathering around them in defensive patterns. Ghost Rider stepped forward, Hellfire igniting in response to Vader's presence. You survived the Penance Stare. Do you truly wish to test whether you can survive a second judgment? I did not come to fight. Vader's statement was simple, but the conflict underlying it was palpable. I came to provide intelligence. The silence stretched as everyone processed this unexpected development. Vader, the Emperor's enforcer, the butcher of the Jedi, offering help to beings working against Imperial interests. Why? Sela asked, her Force senses probing Vader for deception. What she found confused her, genuine intent mixed with profound internal conflict. Because the Emperor's ritual is an abomination even by Sith standards, Vader said. Nihilus's techniques require the sacrifice of dozens of Force-sensitive beings, not quick deaths, but slow consumption of their life force while they experience maximum suffering. The Emperor has assembled prisoners, Jedi survivors, Force-sensitive children captured by Inquisitors, even former Imperial Force adepts who displeased him. You object to suffering? Kirvash's tone was skeptical. You who strangled your own wife? Vader's breathing intensified, his mechanical hands clenching. The Penance Stare's echoes still resonated through his psyche. Padmé's perspective of her death, the children's terror in the temple, decades of victims experiencing his brutality. The memories were weapons turned inward, and for the first time in years, Anakin Skywalker's conscience was not completely buried. I have done evil beyond measure, Vader acknowledged. The Penance Stare showed me that, in detail, I cannot escape. But I retain enough awareness to recognize that some evils surpass even my crimes. The Emperor's ritual would torture Force-sensitive children to death over hours, extracting their suffering to fuel his binding. This is not strategy. This is not necessity. This is cruelty for its own sake. Darkness that serves no purpose beyond demonstrating power. Ghost Rider's Hellfire dimmed slightly, sensing the genuine conflict within Vader's corrupted soul. The Dark Lord was not redeemed. Redemption would require decades of atonement the galaxy was unlikely to grant. But he was no longer absolute in his service to evil. Where are the prisoners held? The rider asked. Detention level Aurek 9, beneath the palace. 47 Force-sensitives, ages ranging from 7 to 63. Security is heavy. Stormtroopers, force fields, automated defenses. The Emperor plans to begin the ritual in 3 days, which gives him time to properly prepare the subjects through preliminary torture designed to increase their Force sensitivity through trauma. You will help us free them? Kess asked, disbelief evident. I will provide access codes and patrol schedules. I will disable certain security systems at precise times. But I cannot be seen assisting directly. The Emperor would sense my betrayal through the Force, and my usefulness would end. Vader pulled a data card from his belt and placed it on a nearby table. Everything you need is here. Why? Sela asked again. Why betray your master now, after decades of loyalty? Vader was silent for a long moment, his mask turned toward Ghost Rider. Because something showed me what I truly am. Not the powerful Sith Lord I tell myself I became, but a broken, damned creature who destroyed everything he loved and called it strength. I cannot undo my crimes. I cannot restore what I've taken. But I can prevent new atrocities, small acts of resistance against the darkness I helped create. If the Emperor discovers your betrayal, Kess began, then I die. Vader's acceptance was total. Perhaps that would be justice. Perhaps the galaxy would be better served by my death than my continued existence. But first, those children will be freed, and the Emperor's ritual will fail. Ghost Rider studied Vader through the Hellfire's perception, seeing the twisted wreckage of Anakin Skywalker's soul. Still guilty, still damned, but no longer absolutely evil. It was the same complexity the Rider had encountered throughout this galaxy. Beings who were neither wholly innocent nor irredeemably guilty, who carried both light and darkness in proportions that defied absolute judgment. We will free the prisoners, the Rider declared. And when that is done, I will face the Emperor. His guilt is absolute. His crimes span decades and star systems. He will face the Penance Stare, and he will burn. He will be prepared, Vader warned. The ritual chamber is designed specifically to trap you. Force fields tuned to contain supernatural entities, wards inscribed with Sith alchemy, contingencies I don't fully understand. You may be walking into destruction. Then I will burn through his preparations. Ghost Rider's certainty was absolute. No shield, no ward, no ancient technique will protect the guilty from judgment. Palpatine has spent decades hiding behind power and manipulation. Now he faces something that cares nothing for his schemes, only for the innocent blood on his hands. The alliance, temporary, uncomfortable, built on necessity rather than trust, was formed. Ghost Rider, rebel operatives, rogue force users, and the conflicted Dark Lord of the Sith united by the singular goal of preventing the Emperor's ritual and freeing its intended victims. Kes examined the data card Vader provided, her cyborg eyes scanning its contents. These codes are legitimate. Patrol schedules match our intelligence. Either this is the most elaborate trap in history, or Vader is actually helping us. Both can be true, Kirvash observed. But sometimes you have to accept help from monsters to fight bigger monsters. That's how this galaxy works. We move tonight, Ghost Rider decided. The prisoners will be freed before the Emperor suspects intervention. Then I will take the fight to his throne room, and Palpatine will learn that some judgments cannot be avoided, only delayed. As the group prepared for the assault on the Imperial Palace's detention levels, Ghost Rider felt the familiar anticipation of righteous confrontation. The Emperor represented everything the spirit of vengeance existed to judge. Concentrated evil, systematic oppression, innocent blood spilled across decades in pursuit of power. But beneath the anticipation was something new. Strategy. The rider was no longer simply following guilt trails and dispensing judgment. Now there was planning, coordination, an understanding that defeating Palpatine required more than supernatural power. It required wisdom, timing, and the willingness to work with imperfect allies toward a greater good. The galaxy had changed Ghost Rider, and Ghost Rider, in turn, would change the galaxy. The assault would begin at midnight, and by dawn, either the Emperor's ritual would be prevented and his victims freed, or the spirit of vengeance would burn attempting to save them. There would be no middle ground. There never was with judgment. Midnight on Coruscant carried a quality of false calm, the brief hours when even the capital's relentless activity dimmed to manageable chaos. In the Imperial Palace's detention level, Alrec 9, guards maintained their posts with professional boredom, unaware that judgment approached from 3 directions simultaneously. Ghost Rider entered through the maintenance shafts, his Hellfire dimmed to barely perceptible embers. Kes and her team infiltrated via service corridors, using Vader's access codes to bypass security checkpoints. And from within the palace itself, Darth Vader manipulated systems with dark side precision, creating gaps in surveillance and patrol patterns that should have been impossible to exploit. The detention level was a monument to Imperial efficiency. Rows of cells containing beings whose only crime was sensitivity to the Force. Children huddled in corners, their connection to the cosmic energy making them targets in an empire that viewed Force sensitivity as either asset or threat, never as simple fact of existence. Older prisoners meditated or paced, resigned to fates they could not prevent. In Cell 17, a Togruta child named Ashara pressed her small hands against the force field, reaching toward feelings she couldn't name. Currents in the Force that whispered of freedom approaching, of fire that burned without consuming the innocent, of judgment that might spare rather than destroy. Ghost Rider materialized in the detention level's central corridor, and the temperature dropped 30 degrees. Guards turned, hands reaching for weapons, training overriding the primal fear that gripped their hearts. The rider's chain uncoiled, moving with surgical precision, wrapping around blaster rifles and yanking them away, striking stun batons from grips, disarming without destroying. "You have 3 seconds to flee," Ghost Rider declared. "I have not come for you. Do not force me to judge whether your service to evil is guilt or survival." 2 guards ran immediately. 5 others held their positions, either through loyalty or fear of what desertion would cost them. The riders' Hellfire pulsed once, scanning their souls. 3 carried genuine guilt, participation in torture, execution of prisoners, cruelty that exceeded their orders. 2 others were simply soldiers, following commands without understanding their full implications. The Penance Stare took the guilty 3 simultaneously. They experienced the suffering they'd inflicted from their victims' perspectives. Every beating, every interrogation, every moment of despair they'd caused in beings whose only crime was existing with abilities they couldn't control. Their screams lasted 5 seconds before their souls ignited, consumed by hellfire that left only ash. The remaining 2 guards collapsed to their knees, weapons clattering to the floor. "Please," one whispered. "We just follow orders. We didn't know." "You knew enough," Ghost Rider said, but the hellfire dimmed. "Leave this place. Desert the Empire. Find redemption in choices better than those you've made. If I see you again while you still serve evil, judgment will be absolute." They fled, and Ghost Rider turned to the cells. The force fields required Imperial authorization to deactivate, but Hellfire cared nothing for security protocols. The rider's hand touched each field in sequence, and the Hellfire consumed the energy matrices, shutting them down without triggering alarms that would bring reinforcements. Prisoners emerged cautiously, decades of oppression making them suspicious of rescue. Ashara was the first to approach, her young face streaked with tears, but her eyes showing hope rather than fear. "Are you real?" she asked in basic, her Togruti accent marking her as from Shili. "Or another test?" "I am real." Ghost Rider knelt, bringing his burning skull to the child's eye level. The Hellfire cast dancing shadows, but close examination revealed something in the flames. Not just destruction, but protection. "You are innocent. The Emperor sought to use you as fuel for evil. That will not happen. My parents are dead," the rider said with terrible gentleness. "The Empire killed them to take you. I cannot restore what was lost, but I can ensure their deaths are avenged, and that you survive to honor their memory." Ashara nodded, child's understanding accepting truths that would have broken adults. Around them, other prisoners emerged. Jedi survivors, Force-sensitive civilians, even former Imperial Inquisitors who had displeased Palpatine and found themselves reclassified from hunters to prey. Kess arrived with her team, carrying supplies, clothing, medical kits, forged identification documents that would help the freed prisoners disappear into the galaxy. "We have transports waiting in the Undercity," she said, "but we need to move fast. Vader's sabotage won't hide this forever." As if summoned by her words, alarms began screaming throughout the detention level. Red emergency lighting bathed the corridors in crimson, and blast doors started sealing, attempting to trap everyone inside. "He knows," Sela said, her force senses detecting the Emperor's awareness rippling through the dark side. Palpatine felt the disturbance. He's sending everything. "Then we fight our way out," Kirvash said, igniting a lightsaber he'd claimed from a fallen Inquisitor years ago. The blade glowed violet, neither fully light nor dark, reflecting his position between extremes. The first wave of reinforcements arrived, not ordinary stormtroopers, but Imperial Royal Guards. The Emperor's elite protectors trained in both combat and resistance to force manipulation. They wielded force pikes crackling with energy, capable of deflecting lightsabers, their crimson armor designed to intimidate as much as protect. Ghost Rider's chain met them head-on. The Hellfire-wreathed links moved faster than trained eyes could track, wrapping around pikes and wrenching them away, striking armor with force that dented even enhanced durability. But the Royal Guards were veterans of countless battles, trained to face Force users and supernatural threats. They adapted quickly, coordinating attacks that forced the rider to divide attention between offense and protecting the freed prisoners. Kes and her team provided covering fire, blasters picking off guards who tried to flank. Sela and Kirvash worked in tandem, using the Force to deflect energy weapons and create barriers that shielded escaping prisoners. But more guards kept coming, wave after wave, an endless supply of elite soldiers willing to die to recapture the Emperor's intended sacrifices. "We're not going to make it," Kes shouted over the chaos. "There's too many." Ghost Rider's Hellfire exploded outward, creating a wall of flame that forced the Royal Guards back. But the rider was constrained. Full power would consume the innocent along with the guilty, would bring the entire detention level down on the beings being rescued. Strategy required restraint, and restraint meant vulnerability. Then Darth Vader arrived. The Dark Lord emerged from the chaos like a shadow given form, his lightsaber ignited, its crimson blade cutting through the smoke and hellfire. For a moment, everyone froze. Royal Guards uncertain whether their lord had come to help or hinder. Rebels wondering if betrayal had been inevitable. Ghost Rider preparing to face both Vader and the guards simultaneously. Vader's blade cut down 3 Royal Guards before they could react. His force choke lifted 2 more and slammed them into bulkheads with lethal force. In seconds, he had created a gap in the Imperial cordon, a path through which the prisoners could escape. "Go," Vader commanded, his voice carrying absolute authority despite the mechanized distortion. "The Emperor's wrath will fall on all of you if you remain." "Lord Vader." A Royal Guard captain stepped forward, force pike raised but confusion evident in his posture. "What are you doing? These are traitors, Jedi scum." "Following orders you do not have clearance to understand," Vader interrupted coldly. "The Emperor's plans require specific prisoners eliminated. I am eliminating them. Now stand aside or join them." The lie was transparent to anyone with understanding of Imperial operations, but it created enough hesitation that Kes's team could usher prisoners toward the escape route. Ashara paused near Vader, her young Force senses feeling the conflict within him. Darkness vast as star systems, but also pain, regret, and something that might have been the ghost of the man he'd once been. "You're sad," she said simply. "You hurt like I hurt." Vader looked down at the Togruta child, and behind his mask, Anakin Skywalker's ghost stirred. This could have been Ahsoka at that age. His Padawan, the sister he'd failed, the Jedi who had walked away from the Order because she'd seen its flaws before he had. The Penance Stare had forced him to experience Ahsoka's grief when she learned of his fall. And the memory burned. "Go," Vader said, his voice softer. "Live the life the Emperor would have stolen from you." Ashara ran, following the other prisoners toward freedom, leaving Vader alone with Ghost Rider and the remaining Royal Guards. The guards formed a defensive line, uncertain whether to treat Vader as ally or enemy, their training warring with the evidence of their eyes. "Lord Vader has betrayed the Empire," the captain declared, making the decision. "All units, he is to be captured for interrogation." The Royal Guards attacked their former commander. It was testimony to their training and loyalty that they lasted 17 seconds. Vader's lightsaber moved with precision, born of decades of combat, each strike eliminating threats with minimal wasted motion. The Force itself bent to his will, crushing throats, stopping hearts, breaking necks with telekinetic force. When the last guard fell, Vader turned to Ghost Rider. "The prisoners are away. Now you must face the Emperor before he can adapt his ritual. I have bought you opportunity. Use it." "You have earned no mercy through this," Ghost Rider said. "Your guilt remains vast. Freeing these prisoners does not balance decades of atrocity." "I know." Vader's acceptance was total. "I do not seek mercy. I seek to prevent new evils before the old ones consume what remains of my soul. When this is finished, if you wish to judge me again, I will face it willingly. But first, Palpatine must fall." Ghost Rider studied Vader, the Hellfire sensing truth in his words. The Dark Lord was not redeemed, would never be redeemed, but he had chosen to act against evil rather than serve it. That was not salvation. But it was something. Where is the Emperor now? In his ritual chamber, adapting his bindings to account for the loss of his intended sacrifices. He will use alternative methods, Sith artifacts, stored Force energy, perhaps even portions of his own life force. The ritual will be weaker without proper subjects, but still potentially effective. Vader pulled a second data card from his belt. The chamber's location, defenses, and the ritual's theoretical weaknesses. The Emperor taught me much, but not everything. Some knowledge he kept for himself. Ghost Rider took the data card, Hellfire flickering across its surface without damaging it. "If this is deception, then you will burn me to ash, and I will deserve it." Vader's breathing echoed in the sudden quiet. "But it is not deception. The Emperor created me, shaped me, used me for decades. Now I repay that favor by ensuring his ritual fails and his judgment finally arrives." The corridor shook as explosions rocked the upper levels. The Emperor's response to the detention breach, orbital bombardment platforms redirecting their weapons toward the palace itself, willing to destroy his own stronghold to eliminate the threat. Palpatine's madness had reached new depths, his obsession with binding Ghost Rider overriding all other considerations. "The palace is collapsing," Vader observed. "If you're going to kill the Emperor, it must be now." Ghost Rider's motorcycle materialized, its engine roaring with Hellfire fury. The rider mounted it, chain coiling around his form, Hellfire building to levels that made the air shimmer with heat. "Then I go to judgment. Stand aside, Vader. Your part in this is done." "No." Vader's refusal was quiet but absolute. "I will accompany you. The Emperor's defenses were designed with my input. I know how to circumvent them. And when you face him, he will use everything against you, including what he knows of the Force and its relation to beings like you. You need someone who understands his tactics. You would face your master knowing it likely means your death?" "I already died," Vader said. "On Mustafar 23 years ago. What remains is machinery and hatred held together by the dark side. Perhaps it's time that abomination finally ended." Ghost Rider regarded Vader for a long moment, then nodded once. "Come then. We ride to the Emperor's chamber together, the spirit of vengeance and the fallen chosen one. Let us see if judgment and redemption can coexist long enough to burn away ultimate evil." Vader climbed onto a speeder bike, its engines whining to life. Together, the unlikely alliance raced through the collapsing palace toward the ritual chamber deep beneath the throne room. Behind them, freed prisoners escaped through the Undercity. Above them, the Emperor prepared his final defense, drawing upon knowledge that predated the Jedi Order and techniques that would scar the Force itself. The final confrontation approached. Emperor Palpatine, architect of the Empire, orchestrator of the Jedi Purge, master of manipulation and dark side power, would face judgment from a being that cared nothing for his schemes or strength, only for the ocean of innocent blood on his hands. The Hellfire burned brighter than ever before, fed by anticipation of the greatest judgment Ghost Rider had yet delivered. Palpatine's guilt spanned decades and star systems, encompassed billions of deaths and the corruption of an entire galactic government. He would burn. The only question was, what would survive when the flames finally died? The ritual chamber existed in spaces the Imperial Palace's architects had never intended. A wound carved into the structure's foundation where the old Jedi Temple's deepest meditation halls had once stood. Here, Palpatine had spent years corrupting what had been sacred, transforming chambers of light into altars of consuming darkness. The walls were inscribed with Sith glyphs that seemed to writhe when observed directly, their meanings too terrible for unprotected minds to process. Ghost Rider and Vader descended through collapsing corridors, the palace shuddering as orbital strikes continued to rain down. Palpatine was willing to destroy Coruscant's governmental heart to eliminate the threat, a calculation that revealed the Emperor's true priorities. Personal survival transcended all other concerns, including the Empire itself. They reached the chamber's entrance, a doorway framed in obsidian that radiated cold despite the Hellfire's proximity. Ancient wards carved into the threshold flickered with Sith alchemy, designed to repel Force entities and supernatural beings. Ghost Rider felt the ward's pressure, reality itself pushing back against his presence. "These bindings are older than the Republic," Vader said, studying the glyphs with reluctant expertise. Techniques from when the Sith numbered in thousands and competed through increasingly horrific experiments. The Emperor has been preparing this trap since he first sensed your arrival. Can they hold me? Unknown. You exist outside parameters the ancient Sith understood. Vader extended his hand, dark side energy crackling around his fingers. But they will weaken you, slow your advance. Give the Emperor time to implement his ritual, unless... Vader's Force lightning struck the wards directly, not to break them, but to create resonance with their dark side nature. The wards recognized Vader as aligned with their purpose, treated his energy as sympathetic rather than hostile. He poured power into them until the ancient inscriptions blazed with light, then reversed the polarity with a technique that cost him. Blood vessels burst behind his mask, organic tissue not meant to channel such forces pushed beyond tolerance. The wards collapsed, their energy dissipating into the Force with a scream of frustrated binding. "That will kill you eventually," Ghost Rider observed, sensing the damage Vader had inflicted on himself. "Eventually is sufficient." Vader's breathing was labored even by his standards. The Emperor is through this door. Everything else is irrelevant. They entered together, and the ritual chamber opened before them like a throat leading to damnation. The space defied conventional geometry. It seemed both vast and claustrophobic, with walls that receded into infinite distance while also pressing close enough to touch. At the chamber's center stood Emperor Palpatine, surrounded by artifacts of power that hummed with malevolent energy. Scythe holocrons floated in geometric patterns around him, each one containing the preserved consciousness of ancient Dark Lords. Nihilus, Vitiate, Revan, Bane, dozens more whose names had been erased from history, but whose evil persisted. They channeled their accumulated darkness into the Emperor, feeding him power that made the chamber's shadows deepen until darkness became almost tangible. Palpatine's appearance had changed, The affable politician's mask had been discarded entirely, revealing what had always lurked beneath, a being consumed by the dark side, until humanity became optional. His yellow eyes blazed with power that could shatter minds, his skeletal hands crackling with lightning that could vaporize durasteel. And around him, a binding circle inscribed in languages that predated spoken word pulsed with energy designed to trap, contain, and subjugate. "Lord Vader," Palpatine said, his voice carrying disappointed affection. "You betray me at last. How predictable. The Chosen One's sentimentality was always your weakness. And you, spirit of vengeance, welcome to your tomb." Ghost Rider advanced, Hellfire trailing from his form. "Your crimes span decades, Palpatine. The Clone Wars orchestrated to destroy the Jedi. Order 66 and the murder of thousands. The transformation of the Republic into an empire built on fear and oppression. Alderaan and billions dead to prove your power. Countless worlds enslaved, families destroyed, innocents corrupted in service to your vision of galactic domination. I created order from chaos," Palpatine countered, utterly unrepentant. The Republic was dying, strangled by bureaucracy and corruption. The Jedi had become arrogant peacekeepers, blind to their own failures. I tore down the old and built something greater, an empire that would endure for 10,000 years, bringing stability through strength. "You built a regime of terror," Vader said, his voice carrying conviction that surprised even himself. "You promised me power to save those I loved, then ensured I would lose them. You promised peace, then perpetuated endless war. You promised order, then created systems designed to maximize suffering. And you benefited from every promise," Palpatine sneered. "How many died by your hand, Lord Vader? How many systems burned because you enforced my will? You are as guilty as I am, more so because you knew better. You were the Chosen One, and you chose darkness." "I did," Vader acknowledged, "and I will face judgment for that. But first, you will face yours." Palpatine's laughter echoed through the chamber, multiplied by the holocron's captured consciousnesses until it became a chorus of damned Sith lords mocking the concept of judgment. "You believe this creature can judge me? I have spent decades studying entities like it, dimensional anomalies, cosmic forces, beings that exist outside reality's normal constraints. I know how to bind them, how to break them, how to make them serve." The Emperor raised his hands, and the binding circle activated. Chains erupted from the floor, not physical chains, but constructs of pure dark side energy. Manifestations of binding techniques that had enslaved gods and demons in ages past. They wrapped around Ghost Rider, constricting with force that would have crushed durasteel. The Hellfire flared, burning against the chains. But they held. Ancient Sith knowledge versus cosmic judgment, techniques refined over millennia specifically to contain beings that transcended normal existence. Ghost Rider's motorcycle shattered under the pressure, its supernatural essence dispersed by bindings designed to negate reality manipulation. "He's actually doing it," Johnny realized with growing horror. "He's binding us." "The bindings are strong," the rider acknowledged, "but they require the Emperor's constant focus to maintain. Interrupt his concentration, and they fail." Vader understood immediately. His lightsaber ignited, and he charged Palpatine directly, blade arcing toward his former master with lethal intent. But the Emperor had anticipated this as well. Without even looking, Palpatine's force lightning erupted from his left hand, striking Vader mid-charge. The Dark Lord's armor absorbed some of the energy, but his cybernetic systems were designed with one fatal flaw. Palpatine had ensured they were vulnerable to his signature technique. Vader's life support began to fail. his mechanical lungs seizing, his artificial heart stuttering. He collapsed to one knee, agony tearing through the organic tissue still buried within his mechanical shell. "Did you truly believe I would not plan for your inevitable betrayal?" Palpatine asked, contempt dripping from every word. "I have controlled you since Mustafar, Lord Vader. Every breath you take is by my permission. Every heartbeat exists because I allow it. You are not my apprentice. You are my creation, and I can unmake you with a thought." Ghost Rider strained against the bindings, Hellfire burning hotter as the rider fought to break free. But with each moment, the chains grew stronger. Palpatine's focus and the holocron's accumulated power reinforcing the binding. The spirit of vengeance, which had consumed souls across dimensions, which had judged gods and demons alike, found itself trapped by the darkest knowledge the Sith had ever developed. "You see?" Palpatine said, turning his full attention to Ghost Rider. "You are powerful. Yes, but power without understanding is merely raw force waiting to be shaped by superior intellect. And my intellect has had decades to prepare for this moment." The Emperor began to chant in ancient Sith, words that had not been spoken in 4,000 years, syllables that caused reality itself to recoil. The binding chains pulsed in rhythm with his chanting, and Ghost Rider felt something unprecedented, the spirit of vengeance beginning to separate from Johnny Blaze's soul, the cosmic force being pulled away from its human host. No. Johnny's consciousness fought desperately. "If we separate, we're both vulnerable. The Emperor seeks to claim the spirit while discarding the human," the rider confirmed. He would bind cosmic judgment to his will, make vengeance serve tyranny. But as Palpatine's ritual reached its crescendo, as the binding chains pulled tighter and the spirit of vengeance began to fracture from its host, Vader moved. Not with his body. His cybernetics were failing, his organic lungs drowning in fluid, his heart's beating irregularly. But his connection to the Force remained, and through that connection, he reached out. Not toward Palpatine, not toward Ghost Rider, but toward the holocrons. Vader had spent decades studying Sith knowledge under Palpatine's tutelage. He knew these artifacts, understood their construction, recognized their vulnerabilities. Holocrons preserved Sith consciousness, but that preservation was never perfect. The ancient Dark Lords within were twisted, degraded, consumed by centuries of existence without body or release. They were, in their own way, imprisoned, and imprisonment created resentment. Vader spoke directly to the consciousnesses within the holocrons, his voice carried through the Force. "He uses you as batteries, drains your power without respect or recognition. You were Sith Lords, rulers of empires, commanders of legions. Now you are tools for a politician who believes himself your superior." The holocrons flickered. The ancient consciousnesses within stirred, millennia of pride and ambition responding to Vader's provocation. They had served Palpatine because he was powerful, because his will could compel obedience. But Vader reminded them that Sith did not serve. Sith conquered, ruled, dominated. One holocron, containing the consciousness of Darth Nihilus, broke from the geometric pattern. Its power, instead of flowing into Palpatine's ritual, turned inward. The ancient Void Lord's hunger no longer directed by the Emperor's will. Palpatine's chanting faltered. "No, you dare..." The other holocrons followed Nihilus's rebellion. Darth Vitiate's preserved consciousness reached out with techniques designed to consume Force energy. Darth Revan's spirit wielded light and dark in combination, creating resonance that disrupted the binding circle's integrity. Darth Bane's essence struck at the rule of two's foundation, the apprentice eventually surpassing the master. The binding chains weakened. Palpatine redirected his focus, trying to reassert control over the rebellious artifacts. But in that moment of divided attention, Ghost Rider broke free. The Hellfire exploded outward with the fury of judgment delayed but not denied. The chains shattered, their dark side energy consumed by flames that burned at the temperature of righteous fury. Ghost Rider rose, form expanding until the rider seemed to fill the chamber, a titan of vengeance that dwarfed even this corrupted space. "You sought to bind judgment," the rider declared, voice echoing with the weight of cosmic law. "But judgment cannot be enslaved. It exists as fundamental principle, as inexorable as entropy, as absolute as death. You have delayed it with ancient knowledge and desperate technique. Now you will face what you have earned." Palpatine unleashed Force lightning with both hands, power enough to level city blocks, energy that had destroyed Jedi masters and shattered armies. The lightning struck Ghost Rider directly, and for a moment seemed effective. The Hellfire dimmed, and the rider's advance slowed. Then the spirit of vengeance absorbed the lightning and converted it to fuel for Hellfire. "Your darkness feeds me," Ghost Rider said, advancing with inexorable purpose. "Every act of evil, every innocent life taken, every moment of suffering you've inflicted across decades, all of it becomes power for your judgment. You have built your own pyre, Palpatine. Now burn upon it." The Emperor fled, his aged body moving with force-enhanced speed toward a hidden exit. But the chamber had become a cage, the walls closing in as Hellfire spread across every surface. Palpatine struck at the flames with telekinesis, with Sith alchemy, with techniques that had destroyed planets. Nothing worked. The Hellfire consumed his attacks, grew stronger, spread further. "You cannot escape," the rider said. "Look into my eyes." "Never." Palpatine's fear was palpable now, the absolute control he'd maintained for decades finally cracking. "I am the Emperor. I am the dark side incarnate. I cannot be judged by a dimensional anomaly, a cosmic aberration." Ghost Rider's chain lashed out, wrapping around Palpatine's waist and dragging him forward. The Emperor fought with every technique he'd mastered, every secret he'd learned, every dark ritual he'd performed. He called upon Sith spirits to possess the rider, used Force illusions to confuse supernatural senses, attempted to sever Ghost Rider's connection to whatever cosmic force empowered the entity. Nothing worked. Judgment was coming, and no power in the galaxy could prevent it. Ghost Rider gripped Palpatine's face with one burning hand, forcing the Emperor's eyes to meet hollow sockets blazing with Hellfire. "Look into my eyes, Sheev Palpatine. Face what you have done. Experience what you have inflicted. Know the suffering of every innocent life you've destroyed." The Penance Stare took hold with the force of a collapsing star. Palpatine experienced the Clone Wars from the perspective of the millions who died. Soldiers believing they fought for something meaningful. Civilians caught in conflicts they didn't understand, beings whose lives were consumed as fuel for Sidious's schemes. He felt their confusion, their pain, their desperate hope that someone would stop the madness. He experienced Order 66 from every Jedi's perspective. The betrayal of the clones they'd commanded and trusted. The burning of temples they'd called home. The murder of younglings who had barely begun their training. He felt their disbelief that the galaxy had turned against them so completely. Felt their final moments of despair and determination. He experienced his own rise to power from the perspective of every being he'd manipulated. The senators whose idealism he'd corrupted, the bureaucrats he'd twisted into instruments of tyranny, the innocents he'd sacrificed to maintain his facade of benevolent leadership. He experienced the Empire's formation and expansion from the perspective of every world it conquered, every culture it suppressed, every family it destroyed. Trillions of lives reduced to statistics, their suffering dismissed as necessary for order, their deaths justified by doctrine that valued compliance over existence. He experienced Alderaan's destruction from 2 billion perspectives, just as Tarkin had, but compounded by the knowledge that he had allowed it, encouraged it, viewed it as politically expedient. 2 billion souls crying out in the Force, then falling silent, their lives extinguished because Palpatine valued fear more than mercy. He experienced the torture of rebel prisoners, the enslavement of entire species, the corruption of young Force sensitives into inquisitors, the systematic erasure of hope across the galaxy. Every evil he'd ordered, encouraged, or allowed was experienced in full from his victims' perspectives. The Penance Stare lasted 3 minutes, an eternity of accumulated guilt, decades of systematic evil compressed into subjective centuries of suffering. Palpatine's consciousness shattered under the weight, his carefully constructed identity disintegrating as he was forced to acknowledge what he truly was. Not the savior of the galaxy, not the architect of order, but a monster whose ambition had drowned civilization in blood. When the Stare released him, Emperor Palpatine stood broken, his yellow eyes wide with existential horror, his mouth open in a silent scream. For the first time in decades, he experienced something he'd believed himself beyond: genuine remorse. Not strategic regret for failures, but soul-deep understanding of the evil he'd committed and its cost. "No," he whispered. I thought the galaxy needed peace," Ghost Rider said. "You gave it war. It needed justice. You gave it tyranny. It needed hope. You gave it fear. And now you pay the price for every innocent life you destroyed in pursuit of power you never deserved." Palpatine's soul ignited with hellfire from within. Unlike lesser guilty beings whose consumption was quick, the Emperor's death took time. He had earned every moment of burning, decades of accumulated sin requiring thorough judgment. His screams echoed through the Force, heard by every Force-sensitive being in the galaxy as the dark side itself recoiled from the purging of its greatest mortal servant. The holocrons shattered, their preserved consciousnesses finally released from millennia of imprisonment. The ancient Sith Lord's essences dissipating into the Force, with what might have been relief. The ritual chamber collapsed, its corrupted foundation unable to sustain itself without Palpatine's power, maintaining its unnatural geometry. Ghost Rider stood amid the destruction, holding Vader up with one arm as the Dark Lord's failing systems reached critical thresholds. The Emperor's consumed soul provided enough energy to fuel Hellfire for years, but Ghost Rider felt no triumph, only the cold satisfaction of judgment finally delivered. "It's done," Vader said, his voice barely a whisper through his damaged vocabulator. "The Emperor is dead. The Empire will fracture. The galaxy changes. And you?" Ghost Rider asked. "You carry guilt second only to his. Will you face judgment as well?" Vader was silent for a long moment, feeling his organic heart stutter, his lungs fail, his body finally succumbing to damage accumulated over decades of dark side corruption and cybernetic dependence. "I'm already judged," he said finally. "By you, by the Penance Stare, by my own memories. Whatever comes next, I have earned it." The chamber's collapse accelerated. Ghost Rider carried Vader through the destruction, Hellfire providing protection as the Imperial palace tore itself apart. They emerged into Coruscant's night to find the city in chaos. News of Palpatine's death spreading through official channels and rumors alike. Imperial forces fragmenting as commanders debated loyalty versus opportunity. Celebration erupting in districts where the Empire's control had always been tenuous. Ghost Rider placed Vader on a landing platform where medical ships could reach him. The Dark Lord's breathing was erratic, his systems failing completely, but Anakin Skywalker's consciousness remained aware enough to understand what was happening. "Will you kill me now?" Vader asked. "Finish the judgment." Ghost Rider studied him, the Hellfire sensing the complexity of his guilt and his final choices. "You freed the Force-sensitive prisoners. You sabotaged the Emperor's ritual. You provoked the holocrons to rebellion. These actions do not erase your crimes, but they suggest capacity for choices other than evil. Redemption is impossible for what I've done." "Perhaps," the Rider agreed. "But redemption and judgment are different concepts. You have been judged and found guilty. Whether you can be redeemed depends on choices you make with whatever time remains. That is not for me to determine. That is between you and the Force you've corrupted for so long." A medical transport arrived, operated by rebel personnel who had received word of the palace's collapse. They approached Vader cautiously, weapons ready, uncertain whether the Dark Lord represented threat or ally. "He dies or lives by your choice," Ghost Rider said to them. "He helped free your prisoners and kill the Emperor, but his crimes span decades. Judge according to your conscience, not mine." The Rider departed before they could respond, leaving Vader's fate in the hands of beings whose lives he'd destroyed and those he'd finally helped save. It was appropriate. Judgment had been delivered, but mercy or vengeance were decisions for the living. Ghost Rider raced through Coruscant's night on a newly manifested motorcycle, the Hellfire burning brighter than ever, fueled by Palpatine's consumed soul. The Emperor was dead. The Death Star destroyed, the Empire's head severed, leaving a body that would thrash in its death throes for years before finally stilling. But the galaxy remained full of the guilty. Thousands of Imperial officers, governors, bureaucrats, all complicit in the Empire's machinery of oppression. Criminal syndicates that had flourished under Imperial protection. Rebels whose pursuit of justice had crossed into atrocity. The work of judgment was far from complete. Yet something had changed. Ghost Rider had learned strategy, had worked with imperfect allies toward greater good, had recognized that absolute judgment without wisdom was simply another form of destruction. The spirit of vengeance remained absolute in its purpose, but now tempered by understanding of this galaxy's complex moral landscape. The Hellfire would continue to burn. The guilty would continue to face judgment. But now, judgment would be delivered with consideration for aftermath, for the innocent who survived, for the possibility that some guilty beings might choose redemption over continued evil. Across the galaxy, beings felt the disturbance in the Force, the Emperor's death, the dark side's sudden absence, the power vacuum that would reshape civilization. Some celebrated, others plotted. Many simply tried to survive the chaos that would follow. And Ghost Rider, the spirit of vengeance from beyond the stars, continued the hunt. The galaxy had consumed the Rider, and the Rider would consume the galaxy's evil until only justice remained. The flames burned eternal. Judgment was never finished. But perhaps, in this galaxy far, far away, vengeance and justice could become synonymous rather than opposed. The night was young, and the guilty numbered in billions. The galaxy would remember this time as the breaking, when an empire that claimed eternal dominion shattered in a single night. When the Sith Lord who had orchestrated galactic subjugation for decades burned away like morning frost under Hellfire judgment. But the breaking was not an ending. It was a transformation. On Coruscant, the Imperial Palace stood as a gutted monument to fallen tyranny. Its foundation chambers collapsed, its throne room empty for the first time in 23 years. The power vacuum created opportunities and terrors in equal measure. Grand Moffs declared themselves legitimate successors, each claiming authority over sectors they'd governed under Palpatine's banner. Some genuinely believed in Imperial ideals of order through strength. Others simply recognized opportunity for personal enrichment disguised as governance. Ghost Rider moved through this fractured empire like judgment incarnate, the Hellfire burning away the worst offenders while allowing the merely complicit opportunities for different choices. Governors who had ordered massacres found themselves facing the Penance Stare, experiencing their victims' suffering before their souls were consumed. Admirals who had bombarded civilian populations woke to find Hellfire waiting in their quarters, chains rattling promises of inevitable judgment. The spirit of vengeance had become the galaxy's conscience made manifest. Patient, inexorable, absolute. But the rider had learned wisdom to accompany power. Imperial personnel who surrendered, who defected, who chose to serve reconstruction rather than continued oppression, were spared immediate judgment. Their guilt remained, recorded in the cosmic ledger the spirit maintained. But they were given time to balance the scales through actions rather than simply burning for past crimes. It was a compromise between absolute vengeance and pragmatic justice, between the rider's nature and Johnny Blaze's lingering humanity. The Rebel Alliance, reorganizing into the New Republic, found itself with an unexpected and unsettling guardian. Mon Mothma established provisional government on Chandrila, her councils debating reconstruction while Ghost Rider's presence loomed over their deliberations like a promise and a threat. The rider had killed Imperials who committed atrocities, but rebel leaders knew their own forces had crossed moral lines during the war. The question of whether Ghost Rider would eventually judge them remained unspoken but omnipresent. Princess Leia, now Senator Organa in the forming New Republic, was the first to address it directly. She met with Ghost Rider on the ruins of an Imperial detention facility, standing amid evidence of torture and execution, and spoke with the brutal honesty that had defined her leadership. "We are not innocent," she said, gesturing to files documenting rebel operations that had killed civilians, destroyed infrastructure, and occasionally crossed into terrorism. "We fought for freedom, but we stained ourselves in the process. Will you judge us as you judged the Empire?" Ghost Rider's Hellfire pulsed, scanning her soul. Guilt was present. Decisions that haunted her. Orders that had resulted in unintended deaths. The weight of leadership in impossible circumstances. But it was guilt acknowledged, carried consciously, balanced against genuine effort to minimize harm and maximize liberation. "You feel remorse," the rider observed. The Emperor felt only pride in his evil. That distinction matters. Does remorse excuse innocent blood? "No," Ghost Rider said simply. "But it demonstrates capacity for growth, for learning, for choosing differently when future opportunities arise. You and your rebellion committed wrongs in pursuit of ending greater wrongs. That is not innocence, but neither is it the systematic evil the Empire represented. I will watch. If the New Republic perpetuates Imperial cruelty under different banners, judgment will come. But if you build something better, the guilty within your ranks may earn their survival through service to that better future." It was as close to blessing as the spirit of vengeance could offer. conditional mercy based on future actions rather than past crimes. The New Republic would have to earn its existence by being genuinely different from what it had overthrown. Darth Vader survived, though calling it survival required generosity of definition. The rebel medical staff stabilized his failing systems enough to keep him breathing, but his cybernetics remained damaged, his organic components deteriorating. He was imprisoned on a rebel medical frigate, under guard but also under care, a contradiction that reflected the galaxy's uncertainty about what to do with the fallen Chosen One. Ghost Rider visited him once, finding Vader in a medical chamber. His mask finally removed, revealing the scarred horror beneath. Anakin Skywalker's face, what remained of it, showed years of dark side corruption and physical trauma. But his blue eyes, visible for the first time in decades, carried something that might have been peace. "The Emperor is dead," Anakin said, his natural voice weak without the mask's amplification. "I am dying," the galaxy continues. Perhaps that is as close to redemption as beings like us can achieve, ensuring the evil we served doesn't outlive us. "You helped," Ghost Rider acknowledged. "That does not erase your crimes, but it matters. When I die, will you judge me again? Will the Penance Stare be my eternity?" The rider was silent for a long moment, considering. "Judgment has been delivered. You faced what you did, survived it, then chose to act against the evil you'd served. What comes after death is not my domain. That belongs to the force you corrupted, and whether it offers redemption or damnation depends on principles beyond hellfire and vengeance." Anakin nodded slowly, accepting that uncertainty was all the answer he would receive. He died 3 days later, his systems finally failing completely, his last words spoken to a medical droid. "Tell Luke, I tried to choose light at the end." Ghost Rider felt the death through the Force's disturbance, a massive presence in the dark side suddenly absent, leaving a void that would take years to fill. Whether Anakin Skywalker found redemption or damnation in whatever afterlife the Force provided was beyond the rider's knowledge. But he had faced judgment, acknowledged his evil, and acted against it in his final days. That was more than most guilty beings achieved. The freed Force-sensitive prisoners, 47 souls rescued from Palpatine's intended sacrifice, became the foundation of something new. Ciela, the former Padawan who had betrayed her order to survive, gathered them on a remote world and began teaching what she remembered of Jedi philosophy, tempered by the understanding that absolute adherence to ancient doctrine had contributed to the Order's fall. These were not the Jedi of old, bound by restrictions that had proven untenable. These were Force users, learning to balance light and dark, power and responsibility, individual needs and collective good. Ashara, the young Togruta who had touched Vader's pain, became one of the brightest students. Her natural empathy combined with her traumatic rescue, creating someone who understood both darkness and the possibility of redemption. She would never forget the burning skull that had freed her, the chains of hellfire that broke her restraints, the absolute judgment that had killed her captors but spared her. She would carry that lesson forward. That power existed to protect the innocent and punish the guilty. And the difference between those categories mattered more than any philosophical debate. Ghost Rider continued hunting through the galaxy's sectors, following guilt trails that stretched across systems. The worst Imperial remnants, those who had committed genocide, who had ordered planetary bombardments, who had built careers on calculated cruelty, all faced the Penance Stare. Some burned immediately, their souls too corrupt for any mitigation. Others survived with minds shattered by experiencing their victims' suffering, their remaining years spent in institutions trying to process guilt too vast for human consciousness to contain. But the rider also encountered beings whose guilt was more complicated. Clone troopers who had executed Order 66 while under behavioral chips, their free will overridden by Palpatine's programming. Pirates who had killed Imperial tax collectors, but also innocent merchants. Governors who had enforced brutal laws to prevent worse governors from taking their positions. The galaxy's moral landscape remained stubbornly complex, refusing to conform to simple categories of guilty and innocent. Johnny Blaze's voice within the spirit of vengeance grew stronger, his humanity tempering absolute judgment with practical wisdom. The rider learned to distinguish between beings who should burn and beings who should be given chances to choose differently. It was an evolution of purpose, vengeance maturing into justice, punishment becoming education, absolute judgment acknowledging that some beings deserved opportunities for redemption. In the criminal underworld, Ghost Rider's reputation created unexpected effects. Hutt crime lords began reviewing their operations, eliminating the most egregious exploitation to avoid attracting the Flaming Skull's attention. Pirate crews debated the morality of their targets, preferring Imperial remnants to civilian vessels. The Black Sun Syndicate implemented policies prohibiting trafficking in sentient beings, calculating that profits from slavery weren't worth facing judgment that consumed souls. It wasn't genuine morality. It was fear disguised as conscience. But the result was the same. Vulnerable beings exploited less, innocents protected more. The galaxy's criminal element choosing lesser evils to avoid absolute judgment. Ghost Rider had become the conscience the galaxy's worst inhabitants feared more than law or retribution. The Jedi Order's few remaining survivors emerged from hiding, sensing through the Force that the Empire had fallen and something unprecedented had replaced it. Obi-Wan Kenobi, aged but still powerful, sought audience with Ghost Rider on Tatooine, standing in the desert where he'd spent years watching over Luke Skywalker. "You have changed this galaxy fundamentally," Obi-Wan said, his blue eyes studying the rider with a master's perception. "The Emperor's death, the Empire's fracture, the fear you've instilled in beings who thought themselves beyond consequence. These are transformations the Jedi spent decades failing to achieve." "The Jedi failed because they confused peace with order," Ghost Rider replied. "They preserved systems rather than protecting beings, valued doctrine over wisdom. You allowed Palpatine to rise because you were looking for Sith where you expected them, rather than where they actually were." "Yes," Obi-Wan acknowledged, without defensiveness. "We failed catastrophically. Our arrogance and rigidity contributed to the galaxy's fall. Which is why I ask, will you judge us as well? The Jedi's failure enabled the Empire. Does that make us guilty?" The rider's Hellfire pulsed thoughtfully. "Failure is not the same as malice. The Jedi were blind, arrogant, trapped by tradition that no longer served wisdom. But your intentions were genuine protection of the innocent, even if your methods proved inadequate. I judge acts, not failures. Acts of evil, not mistakes of judgment. And if the Jedi rise again, if we repeat our errors, then judgment will come," Ghost Rider said simply. "The Force is life energy, connection, balance between light and dark. Use it to protect the innocent, and we have no conflict. Use it to impose dogma, to control rather than guide, to value order over justice. Then we will speak again, and the conversation will be less pleasant." Obi-Wan bowed slightly, accepting the warning. "The order that rises, if any does, will be different. It will have to be. The old ways led to destruction. Perhaps having a cosmic force of judgment watching over us will prevent future arrogance. As Ghost Rider prepared to depart, Obi-Wan asked one final question. Will you ever leave this galaxy? Return to wherever you came from? The rider paused, Johnny and the spirit consulting internally. The breach that brought us here has closed. Palpatine's ritual created the dimensional tear, and his death sealed it. We may be trapped in this galaxy permanently. If so, then this becomes our purpose, the spirit responded. A galaxy of trillions, countless worlds, endless opportunities for evil and justice alike. We will never lack for guilty beings to judge. Unknown, Ghost Rider said to Obi-Wan. But while I remain, the guilty will burn. Tell the beings of this galaxy. Innocence will be protected, evil will be judged, and no power, not the Force, not technology, not ancient knowledge, will shield the guilty from consequences. That is my promise and my purpose. The rider departed, leaving Obi-Wan alone in the desert, contemplating a galaxy where divine judgment had become literal rather than metaphorical. Years would pass. The new republic would stabilize or fracture. Imperial remnants would fight for dominance or accept defeat. The Force would seek new balance after decades of Sith domination. And through it all, Ghost Rider would hunt, following guilt trails across the galaxy, dispensing judgment to those who deserved it, protecting innocence wherever it could be found. The galaxy, far, far away, had gained something it had never possessed. A force of absolute justice that existed outside political systems, beyond factional allegiances, caring nothing for power or manipulation. The guilty would burn, the innocent would be protected, and the line between those categories would be drawn by cosmic principles rather than convenient interpretation. Ghost Rider had consumed the Star Wars galaxy's greatest evil. Now the spirit of vengeance would ensure that evil successors, whatever form they took, would face the same judgment. The Hellfire burned eternal, patient and inexorable, a promise written in flames across the galactic sky. The guilty cannot escape. The innocent will be avenged. Justice exists, absolute and unavoidable, and judgment rides forever.